It was late autumn in the year 1876 when the sunlight finally failed to warm the limestone ridges of Lampasas County, Texas, signaling a winter that would freeze the ground and the blood of the men walking upon it. John Pinckney Higgins, known to every soul in the territory simply as Pink, sat high in his saddle, his eyes scanning the scrub brush and rocky outcroppings that defined his rangeland. The air held a crisp bite, carrying the dry scent of dead mesquite and the musk of cattle that had spent the summer grazing on the open range. Higgins was not a man given to flights of fancy or wasted motion. He was a rancher who understood that his livelihood depended entirely on the accurate count of the beasts roaming the hills. He pulled the brim of his hat lower against the glare, his leather chaps creaking against the saddle leather with every shift of his weight. He was looking for strays, animals that had wandered into the dense thickets to escape the driving wind, but what he found was a contradiction that would ignite a war. In a small clearing bordered by twisted oak trees, a cow stood grazing on the yellowed grass, her coat thick with the coming winter growth. Beside her, a calf nudged at her flank, seeking the udder with the frantic, instinctive rhythm of a nursing animal. Higgins reined his horse to a halt, the animal beneath him snorting and shaking its mane, the bit clinking softly in the silence of the afternoon. He watched the pair for a long moment, observing the maternal bond that dictated the hierarchy of the herd. The cow turned her head to lick the calf's shoulder, a gesture of ownership and recognition that nature used to bind mother and offspring. There was no dispute in the biology of the scene. The calf belonged to the cow and the cow belonged to Higgins. The brand on the cow's hip was his own, a scarred testament to the hot iron applied seasons ago, jagged and clear against the hide. Higgins nudged his horse forward, the ice, hooves crunching over loose gravel, closing the distance to get a better look at the younger animal. The calf turned, startled by the intrusion, and the sunlight caught the fresh mark seared into its own hide. It was not the Higgins brand. The mark was distinct, angry and healing, the lines forming the clear symbol of the Horrell brothers. The implication settled in Higgins's mind with the weight of a stone dropping into a deep well. A calf sucking a Higgins cow, yet bearing a Horrell brand, meant only one thing in the unwritten but violently enforced code of the Texas frontier: theft. To brand a calf that did not belong to you was not a mistake. It was a deliberate challenge, a seizure of property that equated to taking money directly from a man's pocket. The rancher did not draw his weapon, nor did he shout. He simply sat and memorized the scene, burning the image into his mind as evidence. The Horrells were not men to be accused lightly. Mart, Tom, and Merritt Horrell had arrived in Lampasas with a reputation that preceded them like a storm front, trailing stories of gunfights in New Mexico and the Goliad region. They were men who solved disputes with heavy-caliber revolvers and had little patience for the slow turning of legal gears. Accusing a Horrell of rustling was akin to placing a hand into a fire to see if it burned. Yet Higgins possessed a rigidity of character that refused to bend to intimidation. He turned his horse away from the clearing, leaving the cow and the stolen calf in the brush, and rode back toward town with a singular cold purpose. Upon reaching the dusty streets of Lampasas, the atmosphere shifted from the quiet of the range to the restless energy of a frontier hub. Horses stood tied to hitching rails, tails swishing at lingering flies, while wagons clattered over the ruts with loads of feed and lumber. Higgins bypassed the saloons and the mercantile, heading straight for the stone structure that housed the county's legal authority. He intended to handle this through the mechanism of the law, a decision that showed his initial restraint. He filed a formal complaint swearing out a warrant for the arrest of Merritt Horrell for the crime of cattle theft. The act was administrative, involving ink and paper, but in the context of the 1870s, it was a declaration of hostility. The sheriff, a man who understood the precarious balance of power in the county, accepted the warrant with a grim expression. Arresting a Horrell was not a task anyone envied. It required riding out to their holdings, facing men who slept with Winchesters by their beds and demanding they submit to chains. However, the law was the law, and the warrant was served. Merritt Horrell was taken into custody, an event that sent a ripple of shock through the community. The townspeople, accustomed to the Horrells operating with impunity, watched closely. The arrest was not violent. Merritt surrendered with an air of arrogance, confident that no jail in Lampasas could hold him, and no jury would dare convict him. He walked into the cell not as a defeated criminal, but as a man inconvenienced by a nuisance. The trial date was set, and the county courthouse became the focal point of the entire region. On the day of the proceedings, the room was packed to capacity. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the back walls, the air thick with the smell of tobacco, sweat, and unwashed wool. Higgins sat near the front, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. He had brought his witnesses, men who could testify to the mother-calf bond, the irrefutable law of nature that proved the theft. The prosecution laid out the case with methodical precision. They explained how a calf would only nurse from its mother and how a cow would kick away any strange calf that attempted to suckle. The fact that the calf with the Horrell brand was nursing from the Higgins cow was presented as absolute physical proof that the calf had been born to the Higgins cow and subsequently branded by Merritt Horrell. Merritt sat at the defense table, leaning back in his chair, his eyes scanning the jury box. He did not look worried. His defense was simple and relied less on facts and more on the atmosphere of the room. His lawyer argued technicalities, casting doubt on the identification of the animals, suggesting that perhaps the cow had lost a calf and adopted an orphan, a rare but theoretically possible occurrence. The arguments were thin, but the weight of the Horrell name sat heavy on the 12 men in the jury box. They were ranchers, shopkeepers, and farmers who had to live in Lampasas after the verdict was read. They had families in isolated homesteads miles from the nearest neighbor. The thought of crossing the Horrell clan was a specter that loomed larger than the evidence presented by the prosecution. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Conversations were hushed, kept to low murmurs. Higgins waited, his hands resting on his knees, his knuckles white. He believed in the system. He believed that if you showed a man the truth, he would have to acknowledge it. He had played by the rules, bypassed the impulse to settle the matter with a rifle on the range, and brought his grievance to the proper authorities. He waited for the validation of his restraint. The jury returned quicker than expected. The foreman stood, avoiding eye contact with the prosecution table. He read the verdict in a voice that barely carried to the back of the room. Not guilty. A collective exhale went through the crowd, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Merritt Horrell stood up, a smirk playing on his lips, and collected his hat. He was a free man, absolved of the crime by a jury of his peers. The gavel banged to dismiss the court, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the high-ceilinged room. Higgins remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. The verdict washed over him not as a disappointment, but as a revelation. He realized then that the paper laws of Lampasas County were insufficient to deal with men like the Horrells. The evidence had been ignored. The truth had been discarded in favor of fear. He stood up slowly, adjusting his coat. He did not shout at the judge or threaten the jury. He simply watched Merritt Horrell walk out of the courthouse, laughing with his brothers who had come to support him. The Horrells believed the matter was settled, that they had won the game and established their dominance over the local ranchers. Higgins walked out into the winter sunlight, the glare harsh against his eyes. The town continued its business. A blacksmith hammered iron in the distance, the rhythmic clang marking the passage of time. Higgins mounted his horse and rode back toward his ranch, but the man who rode out of town was not the same man who had ridden in. The belief in civil resolution had been excised from him. He understood now that property rights in this territory were not maintained by judges or sheriffs, but by the willingness of a man to defend what was his with supreme force. The acquittal of Merritt Horrell had removed the buffer between the two factions. There was no longer a third party to mediate. In the weeks that followed, the temperature dropped and the range turned gray and hard. Higgins continued his work, but he began to carry his shotgun with a new consistency. He checked the loads daily, ensuring the double barrels were primed. He spoke less to his hands, his mind occupied with the logistics of a conflict he viewed as inevitable. The Horrells, emboldened by the court victory, made no effort to hide their contempt. They rode through the county with a swagger, treating the acquittal as a license to expand their operations. Reports filtered back to Higgins of their boasting in the saloons, their jokes about the calf, their dismissal of Higgins as a man who would not fight back. The winter deepened, bringing ice storms that coated the trees in crystal armor. The cattle huddled in the draws, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Higgins checked his herds, counting every head, his eyes sharp for any fresh signs of interference. He found none. But the insult of the trial festered. It was not just about the value of one calf. It was about the principle of survival. If he allowed them to take one, they would take 10. If they took 10, they would take the herd. If they took the herd, they took his life. The logic was linear and brutal. As the year 1876 bled into 1877, the tension in Lampasas became a physical presence. Men in town walked carefully, eyeing strangers, keeping their hands near their waists. The saloons, usually places of raucous noise, grew quieter when certain men entered. Everyone knew that the verdict had solved nothing. It had only delayed the reckoning. Higgins had tried the path of the citizen and had been rebuffed. Now he prepared for the path of the combatant. He cleaned his weapons with religious devotion, the smell of gun oil becoming a permanent part of his home. The cattle on the range continued their struggle for forage, indifferent to the human drama unfolding around them. The calf that had caused the dispute grew larger, its brand stretching with its hide, a living marker of the injustice Higgins felt in his marrow. Every time he saw a Horrell rider in the distance, he calculated the range, the wind, and the cover. He did not engage, not yet. He was a patient man, willing to wait for the moment where the advantage tipped in his favor. He was not looking for a fair fight, he was looking for a conclusion. Rumors began to circulate that Higgins was done with the law. The town gossips whispered that he was a man pushed too far. The Horrells heard these rumors and laughed them off. They had faced down passes in armies. A single rancher did not frighten them. They continued their drinking and their gambling, secure in their numbers and their reputation. They did not understand that they were dealing with a different breed of adversary. Higgins was not a hothead who would rush into a trap. He was a strategist who was currently rewriting the rules of engagement in his head. By mid-January, the ground was hard as iron. The creeks were rimmed with ice. Higgins rode into town more frequently, watching the habits of the Horrell brothers. He noted where they drank, who they rode with, and what times they frequented the square. He was gathering intelligence, building a dossier of movement and opportunity. He noted that Merritt Horrell favored the Wiley and Toland's Gem Saloon, a popular establishment where the whiskey was cheap and the gambling tables were busy. Merritt felt safe there, surrounded by friends and the noise of the crowd. The town of Lampasas itself felt the strain. Shopkeepers were polite but distant to both sides. No one wanted to be seen favoring the Higgins faction or the Horrell faction. Neutrality was the only shield available to the civilians. They knew that when the ice broke, it would not be a slow thaw but a sudden rupture. The failure of the court case had stripped away the illusion of order. The sheriff, having done his duty by serving the warrant, now seemed to fade into the background, powerless to stop the momentum of the coming collision. Higgins spent his evenings at his ranch table, the lamplight casting long shadows across the wooden floor. He cleaned his Winchester rifle, a lever-action weapon built for speed and certainty, the kind of gun a man trusted when he wanted a fight to end fast. It was not a weapon of mercy. It was a weapon of total devastation. He loaded the cartridges himself, ensuring each round seated clean in the magazine, heavy lead ready behind brass. He was not planning a duel at 40 paces. He was planning an execution. The calf in the clearing had been the catalyst, but the feud was no longer about livestock. It was about dominance. It was about the fundamental question of who controlled Lampasas County. The Horrells believed it was them by right of force. Higgins intended to prove them wrong by right of superior violence. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. The wind howled through the eaves of the ranch house, sounding like the distant screams of men. One afternoon, a rider from a neighboring ranch stopped by Higgins's gate. He mentioned casually that the Horrells were in town, celebrating a business deal, drinking heavily at Wiley and Toland's Gem Saloon. He mentioned that Merritt was there, loud and confident. Higgins nodded, thanking the man for the news. He did not smile. He turned back to his house and walked to the gun rack. The time for waiting was over. The legal avenue was a dead end. The court had spoken and its voice was weak. Now the Winchester would speak and its voice would be undeniable. Higgins checked his horse's shoes, tightening the cinch with a firm pull. He put on his heavy coat, the wool scratching against his neck. He placed the Winchester rifle in the scabbard attached to his saddle, the stock worn smooth by years of use. He mounted up, the leather groaning under him. The ride to town was not long, but it felt momentous. Every hoofbeat on the frozen road brought him closer to the line he was about to cross. He was leaving behind the role of the aggrieved plaintiff and assuming the role of the judge, jury, and executioner. As the skyline of Lampasas came into view, the chimneys smoking against the gray sky, Higgins slowed his horse to a walk. He wanted to arrive calm, his heart rate steady. He needed his hands to be steady. He rode past the courthouse, the building where justice had failed him, and did not spare it a glance. His destination was the saloon. The streets were relatively empty, the cold keeping most folks indoors. This suited him. He did not want an audience, he wanted a target. He tied his horse a block away, from Wiley and Toland's Gem Saloon. He pulled the Winchester rifle from the scabbard, working the lever to verify the cartridges in the magazine one last time. A full load. Heavy lead. He eased the lever back into place with a solid click. He rested the weapon in the crook of his arm, concealing it slightly under the folds of his coat, though he made no great effort to hide it. He walked down the boardwalk, his boots sounding heavy on the wood planks. The sounds of laughter and piano music drifted from the saloon doors. Inside was warmth, light, and the man who had branded his calf. Inside was the past. Outside, in the cold air, stood the future. Higgins reached the door of the saloon. He paused for a fraction of a second, taking a breath of the icy air. He did not hesitate. He reached out with his left hand and pushed the swinging door open, stepping from the gray light of the winter afternoon into the smoky haze of the barroom. The noise inside did not stop immediately, but heads began to turn. The narrative of the calf was about to end, and the narrative of the war was about to begin. The seasons had changed, and the harvest was due. Higgins's eyes adjusted to the dim light. He scanned the room, ignoring the bartender and the patrons at the tables. He was looking for one face. He found it. Merritt Horrell was standing near the bar, a glass in his hand, his back partially turned to the door. Higgins stepped fully into the room, the rifle shifting in his grip. The distance between them was short, perhaps 10 feet. It was the distance across a courtroom, the distance across a clearing, the distance between life and death. The events of 1876 had led to this single point in time, converging on the figure of Pink Higgins standing in the doorway of the Wiley & Tolan's Gem Saloon. This was no longer about a calf. It was about the structural integrity of a man's pride and the enforcement of his will. The air in the saloon seemed to freeze, matching the temperature outside. Higgins raised the rifle. The metal was cold against his hand, but his intent was burning hot. The waiting was done. The talking was done. The war had arrived. It was the afternoon of January 22nd, 1877, when the heavy oak door of Wiley & Tolan's Gem Saloon swung inward, admitting a draft of frigid air that cut through the stale warmth of the room. The interior was a haze of tobacco smoke that hung in stagnant layers near the tin ceiling, trapping the smells of spilled whiskey, unwashed bodies, and wet wool. Pink Higgins stepped across the threshold, his boots landing flat and heavy on the sawdust-covered floorboards. The noise of the saloon, the clink of glass against wood, the murmur of low conversation, the scrape of chair legs, did not cease instantly, but it faltered. Men close to the door felt the temperature drop and turned to see the source. They saw a man whose face was set in a mask of absolute grim determination, his eyes fixed on a point at the far end of the long, polished bar. Merritt Horrell stood with his back to the wall, a position of habit for a man who lived by the gun. He was leaning and sitting, elbow on the mahogany surface, a half-empty glass of rye whiskey resting near his hand. He was laughing at a remark made by a companion, his head tilted back slightly, exposing the line of his throat. He wore a dark vest over a white shirt that had grayed with travel and wear. He looked comfortable, the arrogance of the courtroom victory still clinging to him like a second skin. He did not see Higgins enter. The crowd between them acted as a visual screen for a fraction of a second, a momentary obstruction that allowed Higgins to advance 3 strides into the room without being challenged. The Winchester rifle in his hands was no longer concealed. It was held at the ready, the steel barrel dark tunnels promising destruction. A patron at a nearby table, a man named Mitchell, looked up from his cards and froze. He saw the weapon. He saw the direction of the muzzle. He did not shout a warning. The instinct for self-preservation overrode any loyalty to the drinking class. Mitchell slowly placed his cards face down and slid his chair back mere inches, trying to make himself small, trying to vanish from the line of fire. The squeak of his chair leg was the only sound in the sudden vacuum of noise that expanded outward from the door. The bartender, wiping a glass with a rag that had seen too many shifts, looked up and his hands stopped moving. He saw the rifle. He saw Higgins. He looked at Merritt. The triangle of violence was complete, and the bartender dropped below the level of the bar top without a word, curling into a ball near the kegs. Merritt Horrell sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. The laughter around him died. He turned his head, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted from the close focus of his conversation to the middle distance of the room. He saw Pink Higgins. He saw the Winchester rifle leveled at his chest. There was no time for a draw. There was no time for words. The neurological impulse to reach for the revolver on his hip fired from his brain, traveling down his spine to his arm, but the signal was too slow to race against the mechanics of a hammer already falling. Higgins did not hesitate. He did not ask for a surrender. He had come to execute a sentence he believed the law had failed to impose. The crack of the rifle was deafening within the confined space of the saloon. It was a physical blow to the ears of everyone present, a concussive wave that rattled the bottles on the shelves and shook the dust from the rafters. A massive cloud of white sulfuric smoke erupted from the muzzle, expanding instantly to obscure Higgins from view. The charge of heavy lead bridged the short distance between the two men faster than thought. The projectiles did not spread significantly at such close range. They traveled as a tight, chaotic cluster of destruction. The impact was simultaneous and catastrophic. The slug struck Merritt Horrell in the upper chest and neck. The physical force of the blast lifted him off his feet and slammed him backward against the wall. The sound of the impact was a wet, heavy thud that was audible even over the ringing in the ears of the witnesses. The projectiles shredded the fabric of his vest and shirt, driving fabric, buttons, and bone fragments deep into the chest cavity. The damage to the anatomy was absolute. Ribs shattered into jagged splinters. The lungs were perforated instantly. The large arteries in the neck and upper chest were severed, resulting in an immediate and massive drop in blood pressure. Merritt slid down the wall, his legs useless. He did not scream. The trauma to his lungs and airway made vocalization impossible. He landed in a heap on the floor, his back propped against the base of the bar. Blood pumped from the ruin of his chest in rhythmic spurts that quickly slowed as his heart failed. The bright crimson fluid soaked into the sawdust, turning the floor into a dark, muddy slurry. His eyes were open wide with the shock of the sudden transition from life to the process of dying. His hand, which had twitched toward his gun, now lay limp in his lap, the fingers curling inward in a final spasm. The smoke from the discharge hung thick in the air, stinging the eyes and throats of the patrons. For a long moment there was no movement. The violence had been so sudden, so extreme, that the brains of the witnesses struggled to process the reality of the scene. A man sat dead against the bar, destroyed by a burst of lead, while the man who killed him stood amidst the smoke, the weapon still raised. Higgins did not immediately lower the rifle. He kept it trained on the slump of the body, watching for any sign of movement, any final act of defiance. He saw none. The chest did not rise. The blood pooled and stopped pulsing. Merritt Horrell was dead before the smoke had even begun to clear. Higgins worked the lever of the Winchester rifle. The metallic clacked loud in the silence. A spent casing flicked out, bouncing on the floor with a hollow sound. He eased the lever forward again, chambering another round with a calm, practiced motion. He was now ready. He scanned the room, his eyes moving from face to face. He was looking for any man who might be foolish enough to draw on him. None did. Men stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. Hands were raised empty, palms out. No one moved toward a weapon. No one spoke a word of protest. The brutality of the execution had stripped the room of any desire for heroism. Higgins lowered the weapon slightly, resting the stock against his hip. He did not speak to the crowd. There was nothing to say. The message had been delivered in the language of ballistics. He turned on his heel, his boots crunching on the sawdust, and walked back toward the door. The patrons parted for him, pressing themselves against tables and walls to give him a wide berth. He stepped out of the saloon and into the cold winter air, the door swinging shut behind him, sealing the carnage back inside. On the street, the world remained indifferent. A wagon rolled past, the driver hunched against the cold, unaware that a prominent man lay dead 20 feet away. Higgins untied his horse from the hitching rail. His hands were steady. He slid the rifle back into the scabbard, the leather warm against the cold steel. He mounted the horse, gathered the reins, and rode south at a deliberate walk. He was not fleeing. He was departing. He knew that the sheriff would come, but he also knew that the sheriff had been in the courthouse when Merritt was acquitted. Higgins felt no guilt. In his mind, he had simply corrected an error in the ledger. Back inside Wiley and Toland's gem, the paralysis finally broke. The bartender rose slowly from behind the bar, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked over the mahogany surface and saw the body. The smell of blood began to mix with the smell of gunpowder, creating a copper-tinged stench that made men gag. A few patrons rushed to the back door, vomiting into the alley. Others scrambled out the front, desperate to put distance between themselves and the corpse. They needed to tell someone. They needed to spread the news. The town doctor was summoned, though it was a futile gesture. He arrived 10 minutes later, carrying his black bag, his breath steaming in the air. He entered the saloon and knelt beside Merritt. He did not need to check for a pulse. The injury was incompatible with life. The doctor noted the entry wounds, the massive tissue destruction, and the lack of an exit wound for the majority of the shot. The body had absorbed the full energy of the blast. He pronounced Merritt Horrell dead at the scene. The body was lifted by 4 men, their hands slipping on the wet clothes, and placed on a billiards table that had been cleared of balls. The news traveled through Lampasas like a grass fire driven by a high wind. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Mothers called their children in from the yards. The name Higgins was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. He had done what the law could not. He had killed a Horrell in broad daylight and ridden away. The town understood the implications immediately. This was not a fist fight. This was not a drunken brawl. This was the opening salvo of a blood feud that would demand a high price from everyone involved. The sheriff arrived at the saloon, pushing through the crowd that had gathered at the door. He looked at the body on the pool table. He saw the devastation of the chest. He knew the weapon used without asking. He asked the bartender what happened. The bartender, shaking, described Higgins walking in, the single shot, and the calm departure. The sheriff listened, his face grim. He knew he had to ride out to the Higgins ranch. He knew he had to make an arrest. But he also knew that Higgins would not submit as easily as Merritt had. Higgins had crossed a psychological river. He was now an insurgent in his own county. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the town square, the remaining Horrell brothers received the word. Tom and Mart Horrell were at their ranch when a rider galloped into the yard, his horse frothing. He delivered the news in staccato bursts. Merritt was dead. Winchester, Wiley and Toland's gem, Pink Higgins. The brothers listened in silence. They did not weep. The Horrells were not men who grieved with tears, they grieved with rage. They looked at each other, and the understanding passed between them without the need for speech. The court verdict was meaningless now. The law was irrelevant. Higgins had declared war, and they would answer him. Inside the saloon, the cleanup began. The bartender threw buckets of water on the floor, scrubbing at the dark stains with a stiff brush. The sawdust was shoveled up and carried out to the alley, heavy and clumped. The smell of death lingered, stubborn and pervasive. The mirror behind the bar reflected the empty spot where Merritt had stood. The glass he had been drinking from was still on the bar, the whiskey untouched. It was a ghost of the final moment, a testament to how quickly a man could be subtracted from the world. The town of Lampasas settled into an uneasy night. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Every sound, a dog barking, a branch snapping, caused men to reach for their weapons. They knew that the Horrells would come for retribution. They knew that Higgins would be waiting. The streets were empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that rolled tumbleweeds down the main thoroughfare. The courthouse stood silent and dark, its authority completely usurped by the events of the afternoon. Higgins reached his ranch well after dark. He unsaddled his horse, rubbing the animal down with straw. He walked into his house where the fire had burned down to embers. He added logs to the grate, watching the flames lick up the dry wood. He cleaned the rifle again, wiping away the powder residue from the barrel. He replaced the spent cartridge in his pocket with a fresh one from a box on the shelf. He sat in his chair, the weapon across his lap, and waited. He did not sleep that night. He listened to the wind and thought about the geometry of the saloon, the line of sight, the fall of the body. He replayed the moment over and over, analyzing it for mistakes. He found none. It had been efficient. The killing of Merritt Horrell was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a tactical removal of a threat. Higgins viewed the Horrells as a pestilence that was consuming his livelihood and his dignity. To kill one was to reduce the strength of the pack. But Higgins was intelligent enough to know that a wounded pack is the most dangerous kind. He knew that Tom and Mart were more volatile than Merritt. Merritt was the talker, the face of the clan. Tom and Mart were the shooters. By killing Merritt, Higgins had removed the diplomat and left the warriors. The next morning, the 23rd of January, the sun rose on a changed landscape. The physical features of the county were the same: the limestone hills, the oak moats, the winding creeks. But the human landscape had been fractured. There were now two camps, those who supported Higgins and those who supported the Horrells. Neutrals were viewed with suspicion by both sides. The economy of the town slowed to a halt as men prioritized security over commerce. The blacksmith spent his time repairing firearms instead of plowshares. The general store sold out of ammunition boxes. The body of Merritt Horrell was prepared for burial. The undertaker did his best to hide the damage, buttoning a high-collared coat over the ruined chest. The funeral would be a gathering of the clan, a council of war disguised as a mourning ritual. The Horrells would stand over the grave and swear oaths of vengeance. They would not rest until Pink Higgins was in the ground beside his victim. The narrative of the calf had been eclipsed by the narrative of blood. The initial dispute over ownership was now a footnote in a larger saga of survival. Higgins understood that he had started a fire that he could not extinguish. He could only hope to survive the burn. He fortified his ranch, boarding up windows, cutting firing ports into the walls. He instructed his hands to ride armed. He sent word to his own allies, men who had suffered under the Horrells' heavy-handed dominance. He was building an army. The saloon remained open, but the spot where Merritt died was avoided by the patrons. It became a cursed space, a reminder of the fragility of life. Men drank their whiskey quickly and left, their eyes darting to the door every time it opened. The ghost of the event was more powerful than the presence of the living. The bartender washed the spot on the bar where Merritt's elbow had rested, scrubbing until the wood was pale, but the memory remained. As the days of January ticked away, the silence in Lampasas grew louder. It was the silence of held breath. The sheriff made no move to ride to the Higgins ranch. The warrant for Higgins's arrest for murder sat on his desk, signed and stamped but unserved. The sheriff claimed he needed more men, that the risk was too high. The truth was that the sheriff knew the arrest would spark a massacre. He was paralyzed by the scale of the violence that loomed over his jurisdiction. He chose inaction, hoping that the feud would burn itself out in the brush, away from the town. He was wrong. The execution at Wiley and Toland's Gem was not the end. It was the prologue to a siege. The single shot fired by Higgins had echoed far beyond the walls of the saloon. It had signaled the collapse of civil order and the return to the law of the gun. The citizens of Lampasas looked at their neighbors and wondered who would be next. They checked their supplies, they checked their locks. They waited for the second shoe to drop, knowing that when it did, it would land with the weight of an anvil. Pink Higgins sat on his porch, the rifle within reach, watching the horizon. He knew they were coming. He knew the shape of their anger. He had seen the brand on the calf, and he had seen the look in Merritt's eyes before the light went out. He was ready. The winter was cold, but the heat of the coming battle would warm the county soon enough. The feud was alive, breathing, and hungry for more. The town square had turned deadly in seconds, but the war would take months to resolve, and the cost would be measured in bodies one by one falling into the Texas dust. It was early February in the year 1877 when the ground in the Lampasas cemetery finally thawed enough to accept a spade without sparking against the limestone bedrock. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of sleet, hanging low over the gathering of mourners who stood in a tight defensive circle around the open pit. Mart and Tom Horrell stood at the head of the grave, their hats held against their chests, the wind whipping their coats around their legs in violent snaps. They did not look at the preacher who droned on with scriptures that promised peace in the afterlife, a commodity that seemed entirely absent from the present reality of the Texas frontier. The brothers stared at the pine box that contained what remained of Merritt. The wood was rough-hewn, green and damp, smelling of sap and wet earth. It was a hasty vessel for a man who had been vibrant and laughing only weeks prior. The silence of the brothers was not born of reverence, but of a calculating fury that burned hotter than the coal stoves back in town. They watched the clods of wet clay hit the lid of the coffin, the dull thud sounding like heavy footsteps approaching a locked door. Sheriff Albertus Sweet watched the interment from a distance, seated on his horse near the rusted iron gate of the cemetery. He kept his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle, far from his revolvers, signaling a desperate neutrality to anyone observing him. He was a man caught in a vice between his sworn duty and his instinct for self-preservation. In his coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases were soft, sat the arrest warrant for John Pinckney Higgins. The document charged Higgins with murder in the first degree, a charge that required the sheriff to ride to the Higgins ranch, place the rancher in irons, and transport him to the county jail. The paper was heavy in his pocket, a physical weight that pulled at his conscience. Sweet knew the geography of the Higgins ranch. He knew the sight lines from the main house, the thickness of the walls, and the number of hands Higgins employed who were loyal to the pay and the man. To ride out there now, alone or with a deputy, was not an act of law enforcement. It was a form of suicide. The funeral ended without a eulogy from the family. The Horrells were not men of speeches. They turned from the grave while the sexton was still shoveling the heavy black soil, their boots squelching in the mud as they walked back to their horses. They passed the sheriff without a nod, their eyes fixed on the southern horizon. Sweet felt the dismissal in their posture. They knew he had the warrant. They knew he had not served it. By failing to act immediately after the shooting at the saloon, the law had declared itself irrelevant. The Horrells mounted their animals, the leather tack creaking in the damp air, and rode out of town in a tight formation, rifles scabbarded but accessible. They were no longer citizens waiting for justice. They were a sovereign power returning to their fortress to plan a campaign. Back in his office, Sheriff Sweet sat at his desk, the wood scarred by knife points and cigarette burns. The room smelled of old paper and gun oil. He pulled the warrant from his pocket and smoothed it out on the blotter. The ink was black and authoritative, the signature of the judge crisp. It commanded him to bring the body of John Pinckney Higgins before the court. Sweet looked at his deputy, a young man named Billy, who was currently staring out the window at the empty street. Billy had already made it clear that he would turn in his badge before he rode against Pink Higgins. The deputy had a wife and a new child, and the salary of the county was not enough to purchase a widow's pension. The sheriff understood. He slid the warrant into the top drawer of his desk and closed it. The click of the drawer latch was the sound of the county government abdicating its control. The town of Lampasas felt the vacuum of authority immediately. With the sheriff refusing to arrest the killer, the social contract that bound the community together began to dissolve. Shopkeepers who had previously remained neutral began to stockpile supplies not for sale, but for their own survival. The hardware store sold out of cartridges in every caliber within 2 days of the funeral. Men who usually walked the streets unarmed began strapping on Navy Colts and Remingtons before stepping out to fetch the mail. The conversations on the boardwalks were hushed and hurried. Eyes darted toward the hills to the south where the Higgins ranch lay, and to the east where the Horrells held court. The town was a ship becalmed between two approaching hurricanes, the pressure dropping with every hour that passed without a resolution. At the Horrell Ranch, the mood was one of industrial preparation. The grieving period had lasted exactly as long as it took to bury the body. Now the brothers were in the barn, the large double doors barred from the inside. A lantern hung from a rafter, casting a yellow circle of light over a workbench covered in weaponry. Tom Horrell, the younger and more volatile of the remaining brothers, was stripping down a Winchester lever-action rifle. His hands moved with mechanical precision, removing the side plates, checking the springs, and wiping down the internal mechanisms with an oily rag. He inspected the extractor, the firing pin, and the elevator, looking for any flaw, any burr of metal that might cause a jam. In the fight to come, a malfunction would mean death. He reassembled the rifle, the parts clicking together with a satisfying solidity, and worked the lever. The action was smooth, the steel sliding against steel without a hitch. Mart Horrell sat on a crate nearby, counting ammunition. He had emptied several boxes of 44-40 cartridges onto a blanket, the brass casings gleaming in the lantern light. He picked up each round individually, inspecting the primer to ensure it was seated correctly, shaking it gently to hear the powder. He discarded any round that looked dented or corroded. This was the logistics of a feud. They could not rely on the general store for resupply once the shooting started. They needed to be self-sufficient. Mart organized the ammunition into canvas sacks, dividing the load so that if one man was separated or lost his horse, the others would still have fighting capability. He estimated they had 500 rounds between them and their hired hands. It was a significant arsenal, enough to sustain a prolonged siege or a running gun battle across the county. The brothers spoke little. The plan did not need complex articulation. Higgins had to die. But they were not fools. They knew Higgins was expecting them. They knew he had turned his ranch into a bunker. A direct assault on the Higgins homestead would be costly, perhaps fatal to the attackers. They needed to draw him out or catch him in. Transit. They needed intelligence. They sent riders, men who were not known to be associated with the Horrell name, into town to watch the roads and the sheriff's office. They wanted to know if Higgins was communicating with the law, if he was gathering his own posse, or if he was hunkered down waiting for the storm. The scouts returned with the same report every evening. The sheriff was doing nothing, and Higgins was nowhere to be seen. By late February, the waiting began to fray the nerves of the townspeople. The neutrality of the environment was disappearing. The saloons became segregated by faction. The Gem Saloon became the unofficial headquarters for those sympathetic to the Horrells, while the cattlemen who sided with Higgins frequented a small, unnamed establishment on the north side of the square. A man walking into the wrong bar could feel the hostility hit him like a physical blow. Bartenders kept loaded shotguns under the counters, the hammers pulled back. Fights broke, out over trivial matters. A spilled drink, a look interpreted as an insult, that were really proxy battles for the larger war. The sheriff broke up these scuffles with a weary resignation, dragging drunks to the jail for a night to sober up. But he knew these were just tremors before the earthquake. On the 25th of February, a cold rain swept across the plains, turning the roads into quagmires of gray sludge. Inside the Higgins ranch house, the atmosphere was equally grim. Pink Higgins had not left his property since the shooting. He knew the warrant existed. He had friends in the courthouse who kept him informed. He also knew that Sweet was too terrified to serve it. This paralysis of the law suited him tactically, as it gave him time to fortify. But it offended his sense of order. He believed he had acted to protect his property, and the failure of the sheriff to even attempt an arrest confirmed his belief that he was the only true authority left in his life. He spent his days positioning men at vantage points along the ridgelines. He cleared brush from the perimeter of the house to deny cover to anyone approaching. He was creating a kill zone, a geometric arrangement of the terrain designed to funnel attackers into the open. Higgins sat at his table, a map of the county spread out before him. He marked the locations of the Horrell sympathizers, the ranches that would provide fresh horses or shelter to his enemies. He was plotting a counterinsurgency. He knew the Horrells would not come at him directly if they were smart. They would try to ambush him. They would try to hit his cattle, burn his barns, or catch him on the road. He had to be unpredictable. He began to vary the routines of the ranch. He sent men out at different times, used different trails to move the herd. He was playing a chess game where the pieces were armed men and the board was 50 square miles of scrub oak and limestone. The psychological toll on the county was immense. Children were kept home from school. The church saw a drop in attendance as families refused to travel the open roads on Sundays. The fear was a tangible substance, a heaviness in the air that made breathing difficult. Everyone knew the history of the Horrells. They knew of the shootout in New Mexico that had left multiple men dead. They knew of the defiance of the state police in the South. The Horrells were not local bullies. They were regional warlords. And Pink Higgins was the immovable object in their path. The collision was not a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. In the first week of March, the weather turned deceptively mild, the sun breaking through the clouds to warm the damp earth. The mud began to dry into hard ruts. The sheriff received a letter from the governor's office in Austin inquiring about the unrest in Lampasas. The state government was hearing rumors of a breakdown in order. Sweet wrote a careful reply minimizing the danger, claiming that the situation was under control and that the investigation into the death of Merritt Horrell was proceeding. He lied with the desperation of a man trying to keep his job while saving his life. He sealed the letter and sent it on the stagecoach, hoping that the bureaucracy of the state capitol would be slow to react. He needed time to figure out how to survive the coming spring. The Horrells grew tired of the defensive posture. Mart Horrell decided that if the law would not bring Higgins to them, and if Higgins would not come out, they would have to force the issue. They began to ride aggressively near the Higgins property lines. They cut fences, they scattered small groups of cattle. These were probes, tests of Higgins's patience and his defensive perimeter. They wanted to see how he would react, how long it would take his men to respond. They were baiting the trap. They left tracks clearly visible in the soft ground, signing their work with the arrogance of men who did not fear retribution. Higgins saw the cut fences. He saw the scattered herds. He understood the message. They were trying to draw him out into the open range where their superior numbers and horsemanship would give them the advantage. He refused to bite. He sent men to repair the wire only under the cover of darkness. He kept his main force close to the house. He was disciplined. He knew that anger was a liability. He would fight on his terms, on his ground, at his chosen time. He told his men to hold their fire unless they had a clear target and a certain kill. There would be no warning shots. The sheriff, hearing reports of the fence cutting, rode out to the Horrell ranch flanked by 2 reluctant deputies. He did not go to arrest anyone. He went to counsel peace. He found Mart and Tom in the corral breaking a new horse. The animal was bucking and kicking, dust rising in clouds. The brothers ignored the lawman until the horse was settled, its sides heaving. Then they walked over to the fence, wiping sweat from their faces. Sweet stayed on his horse, looking down at them. He asked them to let the courts handle the dispute. Tom Horrell laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He asked the sheriff where the court was when his brother was murdered in a saloon. He asked where the warrant was. Sweet had no answer. He turned his horse and rode away, the laughter of the Horrells following him down the lane. That meeting was the final nail in the coffin of legal intervention. The sheriff had shown his hand. He was impotent. The Horrells now knew they had total freedom of maneuver. They increased their patrols. They began to stop travelers on the road, asking if they had seen Higgins. They were establishing a blockade, cutting off the ranch from the town. They wanted to starve him out, or at least cut him off from information. They were tightening the noose. Higgins responded by sending a rider under the cover of a moonless night to the town of Bernay, south of Lampasas. The rider carried letters to men Higgins had known for years, men who were known for their skill with a rifle and their lack of hesitation. Higgins was recruiting mercenaries. If the county would not provide police, he would hire a private army. The rider returned 2 days later with 3 men. They were hard-looking individuals, their clothes dusty, their eyes watchful. They carried long-range buffalo rifles, weapons designed to kill heavy game at distances of hundreds of yards. Higgins welcomed them, fed them, and placed them on the roof of his barn. He now had the capability to reach out and touch the enemy long before they could get into pistol range. The chessboard was set. The pawns, the townspeople, had retreated to the edges. The knights and rooks, the hired gunmen and loyal hands, were in position. The kings, Higgins and the Horrell brothers, waited for the opening move. The tension was excruciating. It was a silence that screamed. Every dog bark in the night sounded like a gunshot. Every shadow looked like an assassin. The women of Lampasas prayed for rain, for anything that would keep the men indoors, but the sky remained clear and blue, a perfect backdrop for violence. By the middle of March, the paralysis of the town began to crack. The sheer stress of the situation demanded a release. People became reckless. They stopped whispering and started shouting their allegiances. Fistfights in the street became common. The social fabric was tearing apart along the lines of the feud. You were either for the Horrells or you were for Higgins. There was no middle ground. The sheriff locked the door to his office and went home, drinking whiskey in his kitchen, waiting for the report of the first mass casualty event. The Horrells decided to escalate. They would not just cut fences, they would hunt. They began to ride in a pack, sweeping through the draws and creek beds where Higgins's cattle grazed. They were looking for the rancher himself, hoping he would be foolish enough to inspect his herd. They rode with rifles across their saddles, their eyes scanning every clump of brush. They were predators in their natural element. They knew the land better than anyone. They knew where a man could hide and where a man could be trapped. One afternoon, a Higgins hand named Jerry stumbled upon a Horrell patrol near the creek. He was unarmed, fixing a wagon wheel. The Horrells surrounded him. They did not kill him. They gave him a message. Tell Higgins to come out. Tell him we are waiting. Tell him the grave is dug. They let Jerry go. He rode back to the ranch house at a gallop, his face white. He delivered the message to Higgins. The rancher listened, his face impassive. He cleaned his fingernails with a small knife. He told Jerry to go back to work. He did not send a reply. His silence was the reply. The Horrells took the silence as an insult. Their rage hardened into a cold, tactical resolve. They stopped drinking, they stopped boasting, they focused entirely on the hunt. They studied the maps, they analyzed the terrain. They realized that Higgins would never come out unless he felt safe, or unless he was tricked. They began to devise a plan to lure him into a kill box. They would use the terrain of Battleground, a winding waterway with steep banks and heavy brush. It was a place where visibility was low and escape was difficult. It was the perfect place for an ambush. As March dragged on, the inevitability of the conflict settled over the region like a shroud. The birds sang in the trees, the wildflowers began to bloom, but the beauty of the Texas spring was lost on the inhabitants of Lampasas. They saw only cover for gunmen and clear fields of fire. The law had refused to act, and in its absence, a more primal law had taken hold. It was the law of blood, the law of retribution, the law of the survivor. The arrest warrant in the sheriff's desk gathered dust, a meaningless piece of paper in a world ruled by high-velocity metal. The stage was fully set. The actors were in place. The audience was terrified. The curtain was about to rise on the next act of the tragedy. The brothers checked their cinches. Higgins checked his loads. The distance between them was shrinking, not in miles, but in time. The collision was days away, perhaps hours. And when it happened, it would not be a simple arrest. It would be a slaughter. The sun went down on the last peaceful days Lampasas would see for months, casting the county in a blood-red light that seemed entirely appropriate for what was to come. It was the morning of March 26, 1877, when the sun crested the limestone ridges east of Lampasas, burning off the thin veil of mist that clung to the low ground. The air was still, lacking the usual wind that scoured the central Texas plains, creating a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Pink Higgins lay on his stomach in a thicket of cedar and scrub oak, the damp earth seeping cold through his canvas trousers. He had been in this position for hours, motionless, a predator blended into the landscape. Beside him, obscured by the dense foliage, lay his allies, Bob Mitchell and a man named Bill Wren. They were not talking. They were barely breathing. They were waiting for a specific sound, the rhythmic cadence of hoofbeats that would signal the arrival of their prey. The ambush had been laid with mathematical precision at a crossing on Battle Branch, a spot where the banks were steep and the trail narrowed, forcing riders to slow down and file into a predictable line. Higgins checked the sight of his rifle, a heavy-bore weapon capable of shattering bone at distance. He wiped a smudge of dew from the barrel with his thumb. His hands were steady. There was no shaking, no adrenaline tremor. This was not a crime of passion, it was a military operation. He had analyzed the movements of the Horrell brothers for weeks. He knew their habits. He knew they favored this route when moving between their holdings and the town. He knew that Tom and Mart Horrell would be riding together. The intelligence was solid. The trap was set. Now it was simply a matter of physics and patience. The cedar needles pressed into his cheek, scratching the skin, but he did not flinch or brush them away. Any movement could alert the birds, and the flight of birds could alert the riders. Down in the creek bed, the water trickled over smooth stones, a peaceful sound that masked the violence waiting in the brush above. The stream was shallow here, perhaps fetlock, deep for a horse, clear enough to see the algae growing on the rocks. The birds were singing, flitting between the branches of the pecan trees that lined the water. Nature was indifferent to the feud. It did not care about brands or insults or dead brothers. It simply existed. But Higgins cared. He cared with a singular burning intensity that had consumed his life since the trial. He was not here to scare them. He was not here to warn them. He was here to end them. The waiting was the hardest part of the ambush. It required a suspension of the self, a suppression of the desire to cramp, to itch, to cough. At mid-morning, the sound arrived. It was faint at first, a dull thudding against the hard-packed dirt of the trail. Higgins tensed, his muscles locking into readiness. He signaled to Mitchell and Wren with a slight nod. They shifted their weapons, the stocks pressing into their shoulders. The safety catches were already off. The hammers were at full cock. The sound grew louder, resolving into the distinct clatter of shod hooves on rock. Then came the creak of saddle leather and the jingle of bit chains. Voices drifted up from the trail, low and indistinct. The Horrells were talking, unaware that they were riding into a kill zone. The sound of their voices was normal, relaxed, the sound of men who believed they owned the road. Tom and Mart Horrell came into view around the bend of the creek. They were riding easy, their bodies relaxed in the saddle. They were armed, of course, Winchesters and scabbards, revolvers on their hips, but they were not expecting an attack here, not this close to open ground. They believed their reputation was a shield, They believed that Higgins was holed up in his ranch, afraid to show his face. They were wrong. They rode their horses into the water, letting the animals drink. The horses lowered their heads, the water rippling around their muzzles. Tom leaned forward, patting his mount's neck. Mart scanned the far bank, his eyes passing over the cedar thicket where death lay waiting. He saw nothing but shadows and leaves. Higgins did not wait for them to cross. He wanted them in the water where the footing was treacherous and speed was impossible. He lined up his sights on Mart Horrell. The distance was less than 40 yards. At this range, a miss was statistically unlikely. He focused on the center of the mass, the torso where the vital organs were clustered. He exhaled slowly, emptying his lungs to stabilize the barrel. His finger tightened on the trigger, taking up the slack. The metal was cool against his skin. The world narrowed down to the front sight post and the gray fabric of Mart's coat. The rifle cracked, a sharp whip-like sound that shattered the morning calm. The recoil punched into Higgins's shoulder. Down in the creek, the impact was immediate. The heavy slug struck Mart Horrell in the back, near the spine. The force of the blow knocked him forward onto the neck of his horse. He did not cry out. The air was driven from his lungs by the shock. His horse, terrified by the gunshot and the sudden shift in weight, reared up, splashing water high into the air. The tranquility of the scene vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a chaotic swirl of motion and noise. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, Mitchell and Wren opened fire. Their rifles barked in rapid succession, sending more metal tearing through the air. The water around the horses erupted in geysers where the rounds missed. The air was filled with the angry buzz of hornets as bullets snapped through the branches. Tom Horrell's horse was hit in the flank. The animal screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, and bucked violently. Tom fought to stay in the saddle, his hands gripping the reins with white-knuckled desperation. He was a target moving in 3 dimensions, erratic and unpredictable. Mart Horrell, despite the devastating wound to his back, managed to stay mounted. His body was flooded with adrenaline, a chemical override that ignored the damage to his tissue. He spurred his horse, driving the animal up the steep bank on the far side of the creek. He was riding by instinct, his conscious mind offline, his body simply reacting to the stimulus of pain and danger. A second bullet struck him, passing through his neck. Blood sprayed across the mane of his horse, bright red arterial blood that signaled a catastrophic injury. He slumped to the side, holding on by the strength of his legs alone. Tom Horrell was also hit. A bullet smashed into his hip, shattering the bone and lodging in the muscle. The impact nearly unseated him, twisting his body in the saddle. He cried out then, a curse mixed with a groan of pain. He pulled his revolver, firing blindly into the brush on the ridge. The shots went wild, cutting leaves 20 feet above the heads of the ambushers. It was suppressive fire, a desperate attempt to force the attackers to keep their heads down. It worked, for a second. Higgins and his men flinched as the return fire snapped overhead. The gunfight in the creek bed lasted less than 30 seconds. It was a flurry of violence, a sudden release of kinetic energy that expended itself in moments. The Horrell brothers, battered and bleeding, drove their horses up the bank and into the dense brush on the other side. They were moving away from the kill zone, putting trees and rocks between themselves and the rifles on the ridge. They rode bent low over the necks of their mounts, making themselves small targets. They left a trail of blood on the stones, a crimson map of their escape. Higgins stood up from his concealed position, working the lever of his rifle to eject the spent casing. The brass tumbled into the dirt, smoking. He watched the brush where the brothers had disappeared. He could hear the crashing of their horses through the undergrowth, the sound fading as they put distance between themselves and the creek. He did not chase them. He knew that chasing wounded men into heavy cover was a good way to get killed. The ambush had been designed to end it right there in the water. The fact that they had ridden out was a failure of physics, not of planning. Mitchell and Wren stood up as well, their faces pale. They looked at Higgins. They asked if he got them. Higgins nodded slowly. He had seen the hits. He had seen the way Mart's body jerked when the slug took him. He had seen the blood. They were hit, and they were hit hard. Whether they would survive the ride back to their ranch was another question. A gut shot or a lung shot would kill a man slowly, miles from where the bullet entered. Higgins felt a grim satisfaction. He had drawn blood. He had proven that the Horrells were not immortal. The three men descended the ridge, sliding down the loose shale to the creek bed. The air smelled of gunpowder, a sharp, sulphurous odor that hung in the valley. The water in the creek was muddied by the thrashing of the horses. Higgins walked to the spot where Mart had been when the first shot was fired. He looked at the water. There were dark ribbons of blood swirling in the current, diluting as they flowed downstream. He followed the tracks up the bank. The blood trail was heavy here, splashes of red on the limestone, smears on the leaves where a rider had brushed against a branch. It was a significant amount of blood. Higgins knelt and touched a spot of blood on a rock. It was still warm. He wiped his finger on his trousers. He looked at the tracks. The horses were galloping, digging deep into the soft earth. They were running for their lives. Higgins knew the nearest doctor was in town, miles away. The Horrells would have to ride to their ranch, then send for help. That delay could be fatal. Infection was as big a killer as the bullet itself. A piece of dirty clothing driven into a wound, a bone fragment nicking an artery during the ride. There were 100 ways for them to die before sundown. The Domizayon ambushers gathered their horses, which had been tied further back in the woods. They mounted up and rode away from the creek, taking a circuitous route back to the Higgins ranch. They did not speak much. The adrenaline of the ambush was fading, replaced by the cold reality of what they had done. They had attempted to assassinate the leaders of the opposing faction. There was no going back now. The war was total. If the Horrells survived, the retribution would be biblical. Meanwhile, the Horrell brothers were engaged in a ride of pure agony. Mart Horrell was fading in and out of consciousness. The pain in his back was a dull roar, but the wound in his neck was sharp and burning. He could feel the warm blood soaking his shirt, running down his side. He clamped a hand over his neck, trying to staunch the flow. But the motion of the gallop made it difficult. He focused on the back of Tom's horse ahead of him. He just had to keep that horse in sight. If he fell, he knew he would not get up. Tom was in no better shape. His hip felt like it was on fire. Every stride of the horse sent a jolt of pain shooting up his spine. He grit his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes. He checked over his shoulder, looking for pursuit. He saw nothing but the empty trail. They had escaped the kill zone, but they were not safe. They needed to get to the ranch. They needed whiskey and bandages. They needed to stop the bleeding. The ride took an eternity. The sun beat down on them, the heat intensifying their thirst. Blood loss made them dizzy. The landscape blurred into a smear of green and brown. They passed a farmhouse, but they did not stop. They did not trust anyone. They kept riding until the gates of their own ranch came into view. It was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. The dogs barked as they rode into the yard, sensing the distress. Hands came running from the barn, shouting when they saw the condition of the brothers. Mart slid from his saddle and collapsed into the dirt. He could not stand. The strength had finally left his legs. His face was gray, the color of old ash. Tom managed to dismount, hopping on one leg, clutching the saddle horn for support. He yelled for help. Men rushed forward, lifting Mart, carrying him toward the house. They helped Tom, supporting his weight. The horses stood in the yard, their flanks heaving, covered in sweat and their riders' blood. Inside the ranch house, chaos erupted. Women screamed, men shouted orders. Someone was sent to ride for the doctor, told to kill the horse if necessary to get there fast. Mart was laid on the dining table, the wood quickly staining red. His shirt was cut away. The wounds were ugly. The bullet in the back had missed the spine by a fraction of an inch, plowing through muscle and exiting the side. The neck wound was messy but had missed the jugular. He was alive, but barely. Tom was placed on a settee. His pants were cut open to reveal the hip wound. The bullet was still inside. The entry wound was small, a dark puncture in the flesh, but the area around it was swelling rapidly, turning purple and black. He drank a glass of whiskey in one gulp, the liquid burning his throat, dulling the edge of the pain. He cursed Higgins. He cursed the creek. He swore that he would live long enough to kill every man who had been on that ridge. The doctor arrived hours later, his horse foaming. He walked into a house that smelled of blood and fear. He washed his hands in a basin of hot water and approached the table where Mart lay. He did not offer false hope. He told them it was bad. He told them that digging for the bullets might kill them, but leaving them in would surely kill them. The surgery would have to be performed right there on the table, with only whiskey for anesthesia. Back at the Higgins ranch, Pink Higgins sat on his porch, cleaning his rifle. He ran a patch down the barrel, pushing out the powder residue. He examined the cloth as it came out black. He repeated the process until the patch came out clean. He reloaded the weapon, sliding fresh cartridges into the tube magazine. He looked out at the hills. He knew he had missed the killing blow. He had wounded the animal, but he hadn't put it down. And a wounded animal was unpredictable. The ambush at Battle Branch changed the dynamic of the feud. It was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It was a campaign of extermination. The rules of engagement had been discarded. There was no honor in shooting men from ambush, but honor was a luxury that neither side could afford. Higgins had chosen efficiency over chivalry. He had tried to end the war with a single stroke. He had failed to kill them, but he had succeeded in sending a message. Nowhere was safe. Not the town, not the road, not the creek. The news of the ambush reached Lampasas by evening. The townspeople listened to the story with a mixture of horror and fascination. 3 men against 2, rifles at close range. And the Horrells had lived. It added to their myth. They seemed unkillable. Men who could absorb bullets and keep riding. The superstition grew that they were protected by something dark. But the pragmatic men of the town knew better. They knew it was just luck and bad shooting. And they knew that luck eventually ran out. The sun went down on March 26th, leaving the county in darkness. In the Horrell ranch house, the screams of the brothers as the doctor probed for the bullets echoed through the rooms. In the Higgins ranch house, the silence was absolute. The first battle of the open war had been fought. The casualties were counted. The survivors were licking their wounds. But the war was far from over. It had simply moved to a new phase, one where the goal was not justice, but erasure. As the moon rose, casting a pale light over the creek bed, the water continued to flow over the stones, washing away the last of the blood. The crickets chirped in the brush. The owl hunted in the cedar. The physical evidence of the ambush was gone, carried away by the current. But the memory of it was etched into the minds of the men involved. It was a day that defined them. It was the day the feud became a hunt. And everyone knew that the hunt would not end until the prey was cornered and destroyed. It was early April in the year 1877. And the interior of the Horrell ranch house had been transformed from a domestic dwelling into a field hospital that smelled of carbolic acid, boiled linens, and stale sweat. The windows were shuttered tight against the intrusion of the sun and the prying eyes of any scouts Pink Higgins might have stationed on the distant ridges. In the center of the main room, a heavy oak dining table had been scrubbed down with lye soap until the wood grain was bleached white, serving as the operating platform for the grim work at hand. Dr. Thomas, a physician who had seen his share of gunshot wounds from the war and the frontier disputes that followed, stood over the table with his sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hands were red and chapped from the constant washing in scalding water. Beside him, on a small side table covered with a clean sheet, lay the instruments of his trade: steel probes, forceps with serrated teeth, a bone saw, and a curved scalpel that caught the dim light of the kerosene lamps. Mart Horrell lay face down on the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. The skin of his back was a canvas of bruising, turning shades of purple, yellow, and black where the blood had pooled beneath the surface. The entry wound near his spine was an ugly, puckered hole, the edges inflamed and weeping a clear fluid. The doctor knew that the projectile was lodged deep, pressing against the muscle groups that controlled the movement of the shoulders. There was no chloroform to render the patient unconscious. The supply in Lampasas was exhausted, or perhaps the doctor had simply left in too much of a hurry to pack it. The only anesthesia available was a bottle of high-proof whiskey, of which Mart had consumed nearly a pint. It dulled the edge of his awareness, but it did not sever the connection between the nerves and the brain. Two ranch hands, burly men with calloused palms, stood at the head and foot of the table. Their job was not to assist with the surgery, but to act as human clamps. When the steel entered the wound, the body would react with violent, involuntary spasms that could cause the scalpel to slip and sever an artery. The doctor nodded to the men, a silent signal to apply their weight. They leaned in, gripping Mart's shoulders and ankles, pinning him to the wood. Dr. Thomas picked up the probe, a long, thin rod of metal, and inserted it into the bullet hole. He moved it slowly, feeling his way through the torn fascia and muscle tissue, listening with his fingertips for the distinct grit of metal against metal. Mart let out a low, guttural sound that was half groan and half growl. His muscles bunched under the hands of the restrainers, fighting the intrusion. The doctor ignored the sound. He had to find the path the slug had taken. He pushed the probe deeper, angling it slightly to the left. He felt a sudden resistance, a hardness that was not bone. He tapped the end of the probe against it. Click. The sound was faint, but to the doctor it was the sound of success. He withdrew the probe and picked up the long-nosed forceps. He widened the entry wound slightly with the scalpel, a quick slice that brought a fresh welling of bright red blood. He sponged it away with a rag and inserted the forceps, opening the jaws as he reached the depth of the object. The extraction was a contest of leverage. The slug had deformed on impact, flattening into a jagged shape that hooked into the meat of the back. The doctor clamped the forceps down, locking the handles, and began to pull. He had to twist the instrument to dislodge the metal from the fibers that had wrapped around it. Mart's back arched off the table, lifting the ranch hand at his shoulders off the floor for a second. The scream that tore from his throat was raw and stripped of any human dignity. It was the sound of a nervous system overwhelmed by a white-hot agony. The doctor did not stop. He gave a final hard yank, and the forceps came free, holding a misshapen lump of gray metal dripping with gore. He dropped it into a tin basin where it landed with a heavy ping. The wound was flushed with a mixture of water and whiskey to cleanse it, the alcohol stinging the raw flesh. The doctor packed the hole with lint soaked in a solution of iodine, bandaging it tightly to apply pressure. Mart was lifted from the table, his body limp and trembling from the shock, and carried to a cot in the corner of the room. He passed out before his head hit the pillow, his system finally shutting down to protect itself from further trauma. The doctor wiped his instruments clean, but there was no time to rest. Tom Horrell was waiting. Tom sat on the edge of a settee, his face pale and beaded with cold sweat. His injury was technically less life-threatening in terms of vital organs, but orthopedically it was a disaster. The bullet had struck the iliac crest of the pelvis, shattering a portion of the bone and driving splinters deep into the gluteal muscles. The risk here was not just blood loss, but deep-seated infection within the bone marrow itself, a condition that could rot a man from the inside out. He had watched his brother's surgery, hearing every sound, knowing that his turn was next. He took a long pull from the bottle, his hand shaking so badly the glass clinked against his teeth. The men lifted Tom onto the table. Positioning him was difficult due to the pain in his hip. He had to lie on his side, exposing the wound. The entry point was small, but the area around it was swollen to twice its normal size, hot to the touch. The doctor palpated the area, his fingers pressing into the swelling. Tom hissed through his teeth, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. The doctor explained that this would not be a simple extraction. He had to remove the bone fragments as well as the projectile. If he left a shard of dead bone inside, it would act as a seed for gangrene. The incision required was larger. The doctor cut through the skin and the layer of fat, exposing the damaged muscle. He used a retractor to hold the wound open. The damage was extensive. The heavy projectile had acted like a hammer, pulverizing the ridge of the hip bone. The doctor began the tedious work of picking out the splinters with tweezers. Each piece of bone removed was placed on a piece of gauze. There were dozens of them, some no larger than a grain of rice, others the size of a fingernail. The sound of the metal tweezers scraping against the pelvic bone set the teeth of the men in the room on edge. Tom did not scream as loud as Mart, but he whimpered constantly, a low, keening sound of misery. The whiskey had made him dull, but the pain of the bonework was sharp and piercing. Finally, the doctor located the main mass of the bullet. It was lodged against the inner curve of the pelvis. This extraction required force. The doctor braced his hip against the table and pulled. The slug came loose with a wet, sucking sound, followed by a rush of dark, venous blood. The doctor worked quickly to ligate the bleeder, tying it off with silk thread. He checked the cavity one last time for debris, satisfied that he had cleared the worst of it. The stitching took another 20 minutes. The needle punched through the tough skin, pulling the edges of the wound together. Tom had stopped making noise. He was staring at the wall with glassy, unfocused eyes, his mind retreated to a place far away from the room. When the final knot was tied, he was carried to a bed next to his brother. The room fell silent save for the heavy breathing of the two patients and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The floor around the table was slick with fluid. The doctor washed his hands again, the water in the basin turning a dark crimson. He had done his part. Now the physiology of the Horrell brothers had to do the rest. The days that followed were a blur of fever and delirium. The wounds, despite the doctor's best efforts, became infected. This was the era before antibiotics, where the only defense against bacteria was the strength of the immune system. Mart's temperature spiked on the third day. He thrashed in his bed, shouting orders to men who weren't there, reliving the ambush in a loop. His skin was dry and burning hot. The ranch hands took turns sitting by the beds, sponging the brothers with cool water, forcing broth between their cracked lips. The smell in the room grew heavy, the odor of infection mixing with the sick room dampness. Dr. Thomas rode out from town every other day to check the dressings. He monitored the drainage from the wounds. He was looking for laudable pus, a creamy, thick discharge that was considered a sign of healing in 19th century medicine, as opposed to the thin, foul-smelling fluid that signaled gangrene. On the fifth day, he pressed on Mart's back and nodded in satisfaction as thick fluid welled up. It was gross, but it was a sign that the body was fighting and expelling the toxins. Tom's recovery was slower. The bone injury made movement impossible. He lay rigid, terrified that any shift would grind the healing pelvis. He lost weight rapidly, his face becoming gaunt, his eyes sinking into dark sockets. Outside the sick room, the ranch continued to operate, but it was a fortress under siege conditions. The hands slept with their rifles. They patrolled the perimeter in pairs. They knew that Higgins was out there, and they knew that if he found out how weak the brothers were, he might try to finish the job. But the Horrells had allies. Word of the ambush had spread, and men loyal to the faction began to drift into the ranch. They camped in the bunkhouse and the barn, forming a perimeter of steel around the main house. They were there to ensure that Mart and Tom lived long enough to seek revenge. By the second week, the fever broke for both men. Mart woke up one morning with a clear head, demanding a steak and a cigarette. He was weak. His muscles atrophied from the bed rest, but the fire was back in his eyes. He tried to sit up and fell back, cursing his own frailty. It was a humiliating experience for a man used to breaking horses and dominating saloons. He had to be helped to the chamber pot. He had to be fed like a child. This dependency fueled a cold, hard hatred for Pink Higgins. Every moment of pain, every indignity was added to the mental ledger of debt that Higgins would have to pay. Tom began to move his leg in the third week. The pain was excruciating, but the doctor insisted on it to prevent the joint from freezing. He gritted his teeth and slid his heel up the sheet, sweat popping out on his forehead. It was an inch of movement, then two. It was a victory measured in millimeters. He spent his waking hours cleaning his revolvers, taking them apart and putting them back together until he could do it by touch alone. It was a meditation on violence. He visualized Higgins's face on the target. He visualized the bullet entering Higgins's chest. These thoughts were the fuel that kept him going through the long, sleepless nights. The brothers began to hold court from their beds. Their lieutenants would come in, hats in hands, to give reports on the cattle and the movements of the Higgins faction. They learned that Higgins was staying close to his ranch, likely assuming that the silence from the Horrell place meant the brothers were dying. Mart smiled at this. Let him think it. Let him relax. Let him believe he had won. The element of surprise would be greater when they finally rode out. They began to plan the next phase of the war. It would not be a skirmish in a creek bed. It would be an invasion. The diet of the invalids improved. They ate beef, eggs, and cornbread, rebuilding the blood they had lost. The color returned to their faces. The wounds began to scar over, the angry red fading to a dull pink. The scar on Mart's back was a crater, a permanent dimple in the muscle. The scar on Tom's hip was a jagged line that would ache whenever the weather turned cold for the rest of his life. These were not just injuries, they were brands of the feud, physical markers that defined their identity. They were men who had been shot and lived. In the culture of the West, this gave them a status that no unscarred man could claim. April turned to May, and the Texas spring was in full bloom outside the shuttered windows. The bluebonnets covered the hills, and the calves were fat on the new grass. The contrast between the vibrant life outside and the stale, pain-filled air of the room was sharp. Mart was the first to stand. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot and pushed himself up. He wobbled, his knees shaking, but he locked them and stood. He took a step, then another. He walked to the window and threw open the shutter. The sunlight hit his face, blinding him for a moment. He breathed in the fresh air, smelling the dust and the sage. He turned back to the room, looking at Tom. He told his brother to get up. It was time to stop dying and start living. Tom struggled up, using a cane that one of the hands had whittled from a hickory branch. He put weight on the bad hip. It held. It hurt, a dull throb deep in the bone, but it held. He limped to the window to stand beside Mart. They looked out at the ranch yard, at the men cleaning weapons, at the horses in the corral. They looked at the south, toward the Higgins ranch. They did not say a word, but the understanding was absolute. They were back. The recovery was not just physical, it was a consolidation of power. The brothers realized that they could not fight this war alone. They needed numbers. They sent riders to the surrounding counties, to the drift lines and the camps where hard men gathered. They offered wages that were double the going rate for a cowboy. They were hiring gunmen, pure and simple. They were building a regiment. The ranch became a staging ground. Cases of ammunition were stacked in the corner of the living room. The dining table, once the scene of surgery, was now covered in maps and lists of names. Dr. Thomas made his final visit in late May. He examined the scars. He tested the range of motion. He told them they were lucky men. He told them that by all rights they should be in the cemetery next to Merritt. He advised them to rest for another month. Mart laughed at him. He handed the doctor a stack of gold coins, payment for saving their lives. He told the doctor that rest was for the dead. The doctor took the money and left, shaking his head. He knew what was coming. He could see it in the way they moved, in the way they touched their weapons. The surgery had excised the bullets, but it had not excised the hate. If anything, the pain had concentrated it, boiled it down to a pure, toxic resin. The Horrell brothers walked out onto the porch of their ranch house for the first time in 6 weeks. The sun was warm. The men in the yard stopped what they were doing and looked up. They saw the brothers standing there, gaunt but upright. A cheer went up, a rough, spontaneous shout of approval. The boss men were back. The waiting was over. Mart raised a hand to acknowledge them. He looked at his hands, pale from the indoors, and flexed his fingers. He was ready to hold the reins again. He was ready to hold a Winchester. The survival of the Horrell brothers was a catastrophe for the peace of Lampasas County. If they had died, the feud might have ended there. A tragic but finite chapter. But their survival ensured that the conflict would escalate. They were no longer fighting for a calf or a court verdict. They were fighting to prove that they could not be killed. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side, and they had brought the shadow back with them. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, Tom sat on the porch rail, whittling a piece of wood with a sharp knife. He tested the edge against his thumb. He looked at Mart. He asked if the horses were ready. Mart nodded. The horses were fat and rested. The men were ready. The guns were oiled. They would not hide in the brush like Higgins. They would ride right down the center of the street. They would look him in the eye. And then they would burn the whole town down if they had to. The surgery was a success. The patient had survived. Now the patient was going to become the plague. It was early May in the year 1877 when the town of Lampasas, Texas, effectively ceased to function as a municipality of commerce and law, transforming instead into a fortified zone of anticipation. The sun beat down on the limestone streets with an intensity that baked the mud from the spring rains into hard, jagged ruts that threatened to twist the ankle of any horse moved too quickly. The usual sounds of a frontier hub, the clatter of freight wagons, the shouting of drovers, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, had been replaced by a suffocating silence that hung over the square like a heavy wool blanket. The citizens who remained within the town limits did so not out of bravery, but out of a paralyzed necessity or a sheer lack of resources to flee. The conflict between the Horrell and Higgins factions had metastasized from a personal dispute into a regional civil war, and the town square was the inevitable chessboard where the final moves would be played. Store owners spent their mornings not arranging stock, but reinforcing the architectural vulnerabilities of their businesses. Heavy oak planks were nailed over the large plate glass windows that had once been the pride of the mercantile district. The sound of hammers striking iron nails echoed off the brick facades, a grim percussion that marked the passage of time. Inside the general store, the shelves were largely bare of luxury goods, but the inventory of survival was hoarded in the back rooms. Barrels of flour, sacks of beans, and crates of dried beef were stacked high, creating makeshift barricades within the shops themselves. The economy had shifted entirely from trade to subsistence. No one was buying fabric for new dresses. No one was ordering plows. The only currency that held stable value was ammunition, and the price of a box of .44 caliber cartridges had tripled in the span of 2 weeks. Pink Higgins rode into town during the second week of May, accompanied by a retinue of 4 heavily armed men. He did not sneak in. He rode down the center of the main street, his rifle resting across his saddle horn, his eyes scanning the rooftops and the alleyways. He was no longer the rancher protecting a herd. He was a commander inspecting his forward operating base. Higgins understood that the ambush at the creek had failed to decapitate the enemy leadership, and he knew that the Horrells would not make the mistake of riding into a trap in the brush again. They would come to town. They would come to the center of public life to reclaim their dominance. Therefore, Higgins decided to turn the town into a trap of a different sort. He dismounted in front of the saloon that served as his unofficial headquarters, tying his horse with a knot that could be slipped in an instant. The saloon was dark and cool, the windows already blocked by thick shutters. The bartender served whiskey with a trembling hand, spilling amber liquid onto the polished wood. Higgins ignored the waste. He met with his lieutenants in the back room, spreading a hand-drawn map of the square on a card table. He assigned sectors of fire. He designated specific buildings as strong points. He wanted men on the second floor of the hotel. He wanted men on the roof of the livery stable. He was creating a crossfire that would cover every inch of the open ground in front of the saloons. The strategy was defensive in nature but aggressive in intent. He would wait for them to enter the kill box, and then he would seal it with a volume of fire that no man could survive. The civilians of Lampasas lived in a state of suspended animation. Mothers forbade their children from playing in the yards. The schoolhouse was closed, the teacher having packed her bags and departed on the northbound stagecoach days prior. The church bell did not ring on Sundays, as the sexton feared that the sound might be mistaken for an alarm signal. Men walked the boardwalks with their heads down, hugging the walls, avoiding eye contact with the strangers who had drifted into town. These strangers were hard men, mercenaries looking for wages in the coming fight. They stood on the corners, smoking cigarettes rolled in corn husks, their hands hovering near the worn grips of their revolvers. They were waiting for the signal, waiting for the paymaster, waiting for the violence that was their trade. Sheriff Sweet remained in his office, but his authority had evaporated completely. He sat behind his desk, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom of the jailhouse. He had the warrants. He had the legal statutes. But he had no power. The town had reverted to a primal state where the only law was the capacity to inflict harm. Sweet knew that if he stepped out into the street and tried to disarm a Higgins man or a Horrell sympathizer, he would be shot down before he cleared his holster. He chose survival over duty, a choice that ate at him but kept him breathing. He became a spectator in his own jurisdiction, a historian recording the collapse of order rather than a peacekeeper maintaining it. By the third week of May, the heat intensified. The air was stagnant, carrying the smell of dry dust and horse manure. The tension was physical, a tightness in the chest that affected everyone. Sleep was difficult. Men lay awake in their beds, listening to the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind, the distant bark of a coyote. Every sound was analyzed for threat potential. Was that a horse on the road? Was that the click of a rifle hammer? The psychological strain was breaking the weaker residents. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. A man pulled a knife on his neighbor over a borrowed shovel. The veneer of civilization was thin, and the heat and fear were burning it away. The Higgins faction consolidated their hold on the north side of the square. They moved supplies into the buildings, creating stockpiles of water and ammunition. They cut loopholes in the walls of the frame structures, small rectangular openings that would allow a rifleman to fire without exposing himself. They were turning the town into a fortress. Higgins walked the line every day, checking the angles, instructing his men on windage and elevation. He was calm, methodical, terrifyingly rational. He spoke of killing men as if it were a matter of engineering. He did not boast. He did not drink to excess. He simply prepared. News from the countryside filtered in through terrified farmers who came to town only when absolutely necessary. They reported that the Horrell ranch was bustling with activity. They spoke of dozens of riders, of rifles being cleaned on the porch, of the brothers walking with canes but commanding with iron voices. The Horrells were not hiding. They were gathering a storm. They were waiting for their wounds to close, for their strength to return. The town knew that the pause in violence was temporary, a deep breath before the plunge. The inevitability of the attack was worse than the attack itself. It allowed the imagination to run wild, to construct scenarios of fire and slaughter that grew more horrific with each passing night. The saloons that favored the Horrells, located on the southeast side of the square, were equally tense but quieter. The patrons there were waiting for their champions to return. They watched the Higgins preparations with sullen eyes, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty street. They knew they were outgunned for the moment, but they also knew that when the Horrells arrived, the balance of power would shift violently. They kept their weapons close, drinking their liquor in quick, nervous gulps. There was no fraternization between the two sides. An invisible line had been drawn across the dirt of the square, a border that could not be crossed without consequence. Higgins recruited heavily from the local population who had suffered under the Horrells' previous reign of intimidation. He offered them a chance to strike back, to rid the county of the bullies who had dictated the terms of life for too long. He appealed to their pride and their fear. He told them that if the Horrells returned to power, no man's cattle would be safe, no man's family would be secure. He armed these volunteers with shotguns and old muskets, placing them in the secondary defensive positions. They were not professional gunmen, but they were desperate men defending their homes, and that made them dangerous. As May drew to a close, the atmosphere in Lampasas became surreal. The days were bright and clear, the blue sky mocking the grim reality on the ground. The wildflowers bloomed in the vacant lots, splashes of color against the gray wood of the buildings. A stray dog wandered down the main street, barking at a shadow, and the sound caused 3 men to draw their weapons instantly. The nerves of the town were frayed to the breaking point. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with the potential for kinetic release. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a fuse burning down inside a dark casing. Higgins dispatched scouts to the outskirts of town, placing them on the high ground to watch the southern approaches. He wanted early warning. He wanted to know the moment the dust cloud appeared on the horizon. He established a system of signals. 3 shots fired in rapid succession meant the enemy was in sight. The town waited for those 3 shots. They listened for them while they ate, while they worked, while they tried to sleep. The anticipation was a torture that eroded the spirit. Men grew gaunt, their eyes sunken, their hands shaking from the constant surge of adrenaline that had nowhere to go. The livery stable became a critical strategic point. Higgins paid the owner to keep the best horses saddled and ready at all times, not for escape, but for rapid deployment if the fight moved out of the square. He inspected the animals himself, checking their shoes and their wind. He treated the logistics of the feud with the same seriousness he applied to his ranching. Details mattered. A loose cinch could cost a life. A jammed rifle could lose the war. He checked everything, trusting no one to meet his standards of readiness. The women of the town, those who had not fled, took on a grim resolve. They prepared bandages from old sheets, boiling them in large kettles. They filled buckets with water and placed them near the doors, anticipating the fires that would surely start once the shooting began. They moved their children to the interior rooms, creating nests of blankets away from the windows. They prayed, but their prayers were specific and martial. They prayed for aim. They prayed for steady hands. They prayed that the bullets would find the other men, not their own. Rumors flew like wildfire. One man claimed the Horrells had a Gatling gun. Another claimed they had recruited 50 Comancheros from the plains. A third said the Texas Rangers were on their way to arrest everyone. None of it was true, but all of it was believed in the fevered climate of the siege. Truth had no place in Lampasas. Only fear and preparation existed. The reality was simpler and more brutal. Two groups of men who hated each other were converging on a single geographic point to settle a dispute with high-velocity projectiles. On the 29th of May, a thunderstorm rolled through the county. The thunder cracked like cannon fire, sending people diving for cover. The lightning illuminated the empty square in stark strobe light flashes. The rain turned the dust back into mud, slick and treacherous. Higgins stood on the porch of the saloon watching the storm. He did not flinch at the thunder. He was calibrating his mind. He knew the mud would slow the horses. He knew the rain would make the powder damp if men were not careful. He adjusted his plans accordingly. The environment was a variable in the equation of death, and he intended to solve it. The sheriff finally left his office on the last day of the month. He walked to the saloon where Higgins was stationed. He did not go in. He stood on the boardwalk and called out. Higgins came to the door. The two men looked at each other. The sheriff asked if there was any way to stop this. Higgins looked at him with cold, dead eyes. He told the sheriff that the time for stopping it was in January in the courtroom. He told the sheriff to go home and lock his door. The sheriff nodded, a broken man, and walked away. It was the final abdication of the law. The preparations were complete. The windows were boarded. The loopholes were cut. The ammunition was stacked. The men were positioned. The town of Lampasas was no longer a community. It was a loaded weapon pointed at itself. The wait was almost over. The month of June was approaching, and with it the promise of resolution. The Horrells were coming. The wind carried the scent of ozone and the phantom smell of gunpowder. Inside the minds of the combatants, the fear had been replaced by a cold acceptance. They had run through the scenarios so many times that the actual event seemed like a memory. They were ready to die or ready to kill. The distinction had lost its meaning. Survival was the only metric. The feud had consumed everything else: morality, law, commerce, family. There was only the enemy and the space between the muzzle and the target. As the sun set on the final day of May 1877, the town was a ghost of its former self. The shadows stretched long and dark across the square. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound. Inside the buildings, men checked the loads in their weapons one last time. They drank coffee that was thick and black. They wrote letters that they hoped would not have to be mailed. They waited for the morning. They waited for the invasion. The siege of the mind was ending. The siege of iron and fire was about to begin. It was the morning of June 7th, 1877, when the sun rose over the eastern ridges of Lampasas County, casting a harsh, revealing light on the preparations taking place at the Horrell homestead. The air was already thick with humidity, a cloying dampness that promised a day of oppressive heat. In the corral, the horses were being saddled with a grim efficiency that differed markedly from the usual routine of ranch work. There was no casual banter between the men, no jokes about the coffee or the weather. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cinch straps groaning against the bellies of the animals and the metal clinking of bit chains. Mart Horrell stood by the gate, his hand resting on the rough wood of a fence post. He moved stiffly, the scar on his back a tight knot of healed tissue that pulled against his shoulder blade with every motion. He ignored the discomfort. The pain was a constant reminder of the debt he was riding into town to collect. He checked, the load in his revolver spinning the cylinder to ensure the brass cartridges were seated flush. He snapped the loading gate shut, the sound sharp and final. Tom Horrell limped across the dusty yard, favoring his right hip where the bone had been shattered and knit back together in a jagged fusion. He used his rifle as a walking stick until he reached his mount, a sturdy bay gelding chosen for its calm temperament under fire. Getting into the saddle was a logistical challenge that required grit. He gripped the horn, placed his good foot in the stirrup and hauled himself up, his face draining of color as the torque twisted his damaged pelvis. He settled into the leather seat, exhaling a sharp breath through his nose. He adjusted his position, finding the one angle that made the agony tolerable. He was not riding for comfort, he was riding for war. The physical suffering was irrelevant to the objective. He looked at Mart and nodded. The gesture was small, but it signaled that the waiting was over. The recovery period had ended. The invasion was beginning. The force that assembled in the yard was formidable. Alongside the brothers were men whose names were whispered in the saloons of Central Texas with a mixture of fear and respect. These were not cowboys, they were combatants. They wore heavy canvas coats despite the heat, the fabric concealing additional weaponry and ammunition. Their hats were pulled low, shading eyes that were constantly scanning the perimeter. They carried Winchester rifles across their laps, the steel barrels gleaming with a fresh coat of oil. They were men who sold their loyalty for gold and the promise of violence. They checked their girths one last time, ensuring that no tack would fail at a critical moment. A slipping saddle in a gunfight was a death sentence. Mart raised his hand and the column moved out. They did not gallop. They did not shout. They walked their horses out of the gate and onto the main road leading north to Lampasas. The pace was deliberate. A slow walk conserved the energy of the horses for the potential escape or pursuit, but it also served a psychological function. It was a funeral procession for their enemies. The rhythmic thud of 24 hooves on the hard-packed dirt was a drumbeat that announced their approach long before they were visible. They rode two abreast, occupying the center of the road, forcing a wagon driver coming the other way to pull his team into the ditch to let them pass. The driver did not complain. He saw the faces of the riders, saw the weaponry, and kept his eyes on his mules, praying they would ignore him. They did. He was of no consequence to their mission. The landscape they traversed was vibrant with early summer life. The wildflowers were in bloom, splashing the fields with blue and yellow. The creek beds were full from the recent rains, the water running clear over the limestone. But the riders saw none of this beauty. They saw terrain, they saw ambush points. They saw cover and concealment. Every copse of trees was scrutinized for the glint of a rifle barrel. Every ridgeline was checked for the silhouette of a scout. Mart rode point, his eyes moving constantly. He knew Higgins. He knew that Pink Higgins was a man who preferred the trap to the open fight. But today the Horrells were bringing the fight to the sheer open, daring Higgins to show himself. As they drew closer to the town limits, the heat intensified. The sun climbed higher, baking the moisture out of the ground. Sweat ran down the backs of the men, soaking their shirts under the heavy coats. The flies began to swarm around the horses, drawn by the sweat and the smell of the animals. The horses tossed their heads, their tails swishing irritably. The riders ignored the insects. Their focus was absolute. They were entering the zone of engagement. They loosened the revolvers in their holsters, checking the freedom of the draw. They worked the levers of their rifles, halfway, ensuring a round was ready to be chambered instantly. The town of Lampasas appeared in the distance, a collection of wood and stone structures rising from the plain. It looked peaceful from a mile away, the chimneys smoking gently, the flag hanging limp on the pole in the square. But as they closed the distance, the unnatural stillness became apparent. There were no dogs barking. There were no children running in the streets. The windows of the outlying houses were shuttered tight. The town was holding its breath. The citizens knew what was coming. The scouts had done their job. The 3 warning shots had likely been fired hours ago, or perhaps the sheer weight of the impending violence had traveled on the wind. The column crossed the bridge over the creek at the edge of town. The wooden planks rumbled under the hooves, a hollow sound that echoed off the water below. They rode past the first few houses. A curtain twitched in a window, then fell back still. A door was pulled, shut, and bolted. The Horrells ignored these signs of domestic fear. They kept their eyes forward, focused on the square. They were invading the civic center, the heart of the county, to prove that no law and no rival faction could keep them out. They were reclaiming their territory. They turned onto the main street. The dust from the road coated their clothes and the hides of their horses, turning them into monochromatic specters. They rode down the center of the thoroughfare, their shadows stretching short beneath them as noon approached. To the left and right, the storefronts were barricaded. The hardware store, the dry goods merchant, the bank, all were closed, their facades armored against stray bullets. The town had prepared for a siege, and now the besiegers had arrived. Mart directed the group toward the east side of the square. This was their traditional stronghold, the side where the saloons friendly to their cause were located. They approached the hitching rails with a calm arrogance. They did not rush to dismount. They sat in their saddles for a long moment, surveying the square. They looked across the open, dusty expanse to the west side, where the Higgins faction was known to congregate. They saw the dark windows of the opposing saloons. They saw the glint of metal behind a crate on a balcony. They saw the barrel of a shotgun protruding from a loophole in a boarded-up storefront. The enemy was there. The stage was set. Tom swung his leg over the saddle, wincing as his hip protested the movement. He landed heavily on his good leg, grabbing the reins to steady himself. He tied his horse with a quick slip knot, leaving plenty of slack. If the shooting started, the horses would need to break free or be easily released. A tethered horse in a gunfight was a dead horse. The other men dismounted, their boots hitting the boardwalk with heavy, authoritative thuds. They formed a line in front of the saloon, their backs to the wall, facing the square. They were presenting themselves as targets, a brazen display of courage designed to intimidate. Higgins's men, watching from their fortified positions across the square, did not fire. Not yet. The rules of engagement in this feud were complex. To shoot a man in the back was one thing, to shoot a man who was simply standing in the street was another. It required a specific provocation, or perhaps they were simply waiting for the order. Higgins was a disciplined commander. He would not waste ammunition at this range unless he was sure of a kill. He was watching them through a pair of field glasses, analyzing their numbers, identifying the brothers. He saw Mart. He saw Tom. He saw that they were alive and standing. The failure of the ambush at the creek was now a physical reality, standing 200 yards away. The Horrells moved into the establishment behind them, the Gem Saloon. They did not go in to drink. They went in to establish a command post. They kicked open the doors, sweeping the interior with their weapons. The place was empty, the bartender having fled or hidden in the cellar. The air inside was stale, smelling of old beer and sawdust. They dragged tables to the windows, overturning them to create barricades. They smashed the glass of the front windows with the butts of their rifles, clearing the jagged shards from the frames to create unobstructed firing ports. The sound of shattering glass was the first violent noise of the day. A sharp, crashing sound that carried across the square like a shout. Mart took a position at the window, resting his rifle on the overturned table. He had a clear view of the Higgins and Wren saloon directly across the plaza. He adjusted the rear sight of his Winchester, sliding the elevator up a notch to compensate for the distance. He was calm. His heart rate was slow. The pain in his back had receded into a dull background hum, suppressed by the focus of the moment. He was hunting. He scanned the facade of the enemy building, looking for movement. He saw a shadow shift behind a rain barrel on the porch. He held his fire. He wanted a clean shot. Tom took the doorway, using the heavy frame as cover. He leaned out slightly, checking the rooftops. He knew that Higgins liked the high ground. He saw a shape on the roof of the livery stable, a man lying prone behind the false front of the building. Tom pointed it out to one of the hired gunmen, a man named Carson. Carson nodded, moving to a window to get a better angle. They were assigning targets, breaking down the enemy defense into manageable pieces. They were not just a gang, they were a fire team. The sun climbed to its zenith, removing the shadows from the square. The heat became intense. The dust in the street lay undisturbed, a flat tan arena waiting for blood. The silence stretched out, becoming thin and brittle. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. The town of Lampasas was suspended in this moment, the clerks hiding under their counters, the mothers praying in the back rooms, the sheriff drinking in his kitchen. They all felt the weight of the arrival. The Horrells were here. The waiting was finished. Mart turned to his men. He told them to conserve their ammunition. He told them to pick their shots. He told them that they were not leaving until the square was theirs. His voice was low and flat, lacking any emotional inflection. It was a statement of fact. He checked his pocket watch. It was nearing noon. The invasion force was secured in its beachhead. They controlled the east side. Higgins controlled the west. The space between them was no longer a public street. It was a kill zone. A dog wandered into the square, confused by the lack of activity. It trotted towards the center, tail wagging tentatively. It stopped, sensing the hostility in the air. It looked towards the Horrell side, then towards the Higgins side. It whined, a high-pitched sound of distress, and bolted down an alleyway. The exit of the animal seemed to signal the end of the natural order. Now only the unnatural order of the gun remained. The physical toll on the brothers began to manifest as the adrenaline of the arrival settled. Tom leaned heavily against the doorframe, his hip throbbing with a pulse that matched his heartbeat. He wiped sweat from his eyes with his sleeve. He took a sip of water from a canteen, the liquid warm and metallic tasting. He did not complain. He knew that across the square, Higgins was likely sweating just as much. It was a test of endurance as much as a test of marksmanship. Who would break first? Who would make the mistake? Mart watched the Higgins building. He saw the barrel of a rifle extend slowly from a window on the second floor. It was a heavy buffalo gun, a Sharps or a Remington capable of punching through the wood of the saloon walls. Mart respected that weapon. He warned his men to stay away from the thin parts of the wall. They huddled behind the bar and the overturned tables, seeking the protection of the thickest timber. They were digging in. They were prepared for a long afternoon. The invasion was not just about occupying a building. It was about projecting power. By riding into the square in broad daylight, despite the warrants, despite the ambush, despite the wounds, the Horrells had stated clearly that they did not fear the state of Texas or John Pinckney Higgins. They had turned the town into a theater for their defiance. They had effectively annexed the municipality. The law was trapped in a desk drawer. The only authority now was the caliber of the weapon in a man's hand. As the minutes ticked by, the heat shimmer began to rise from the ground, distorting the view across the square. The buildings on the other side seemed to waver like mirages. Mart blinked, clearing his vision. He kept his finger outside the trigger guard, resting on the receiver of the rifle. He was ready. He was simply waiting for the invitation, and he knew it would come. A shout, a shot, a movement. Something would break the tension. The horses outside stood with their heads down, dozing in the sun, flicking their ears at the flies. They were the only innocent parties in the equation. They did not know that they were parked in the center of a battlefield. Their calmness was a stark contrast to the coiled violence inside the saloon. The smell of the horses drifted in through the broken windows, mixing with the smell of the nervous men. It was the scent of the frontier, the scent of a way of life that was violent, raw, and rapidly approaching its climax. Mart looked at Tom. Tom looked back. There was no need for words. They had ridden a long road to get here. From the cattle ranges of New Mexico to the jail cells of Goliad, to the creek bed where they had almost died. It all led to this wooden room looking out at a dusty square. This was the reckoning. The invasion was complete. The battle was inevitable. The clock struck noon in the distance, the bell tolling 12 times. Each chime hung in the heavy air, a countdown to the destruction of the peace. The last note faded. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was final. The town of Lampasas had been invaded, occupied, and was now poised to be destroyed. The sun hung directly overhead at high noon on June 7, 1877, erasing all shadows from the Lampasas town square and leaving the combatants exposed in a harsh vertical light that offered no deception. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the roofs of the Gem Saloon on the east side and the Higgins and Wren Saloon on the west. Inside the Gem, Mart Horrell wiped his palms on his trousers, the sweat making the walnut stock of his Winchester slick to the touch. The silence that had draped the town since the arrival of the invasion force was stretching thin, vibrating with a frequency that set the teeth on edge. It was the silence of a held breath, a pause in the natural order of things where the birds had ceased to sing and the wind had ceased to blow. Across the dusty expanse of the plaza, a distance of perhaps 60 yards, the dark windows of the enemy stronghold stared back like the empty sockets of a skull. The rupture of the peace did not begin with a shout or a dramatic declaration. It began with a mechanical error born of nerves. A young hired gun on the Higgins side, positioned on a rooftop behind a low parapet, shifted his weight to relieve a cramp in his leg. His boot scraped loud against the tin roofing, a screech of metal on metal that tore through the quiet air. Startled by the noise, a man in the Gem Saloon jerked his rifle barrel, striking the glass of the window frame. The movement caught the eye of Bill Wren, standing deep in the shadows of the opposing building. Wren did not hesitate. He raised his heavy rifle, a weapon designed for bringing down buffalo at long range, and fired at the flash of motion. The shot cracked the noon air like a whip strike, a sharp, flat report that signaled the end of the waiting. The heavy slug crossed the square in a fraction of a second, smashing into the wooden facade of the Gem Saloon inches from the window frame. The impact sent a shower of long, sharp splinters flying inward, peppering the men huddled behind the barricade. Before the echo of that first shot could fade, the entire west side of the square erupted in a singular, deafening roar. Higgins had ordered his men to fire at will upon the commencement of hostilities, and they obeyed with a terrifying enthusiasm. Dozens of rifles discharged almost simultaneously, creating a ragged volley that sounded like the tearing of a giant canvas sheet. The front of the Gem Saloon disintegrated under the impact of the barrage. The plate glass windows, which had been partially smashed out earlier, were now reduced to sparkling dust as bullet after bullet hammered through the openings. The air inside the saloon turned instantly into a chaotic swirl of glass shards, wood chips, and plaster dust. Mart Horrell flinched as a bullet punched through the table he was using for cover, sending a spray of sawdust into his face. He did not retreat. He racked the lever of his Winchester, the brass cartridge carrier, lifting a fresh round into the chamber with a satisfying metallic clack. He rose slightly, settling the brass bead of the front sight on the muzzle flashes across the street, and pulled the trigger. The recoil of the rifle drove the butt plate into his shoulder, aggravating the scar tissue on his back. But the sensation was lost in the adrenaline flood. His shot joined the cacophony, adding to the growing cloud of white smoke that was beginning to fill the street. Tom Horrell, firing from the doorway, worked his weapon with a rhythmic intensity. He fired, levered, and fired again, sending .44 caliber slugs streaming toward the Higgins positions. The noise was absolute. In the confined space of the saloon, the report of the rifles was magnified to a concussive level that stunned the senses. Ears rang with a high-pitched whine that masked the shouts of the men. On the street, the world had turned into a kill zone. The ground in the center of the square kicked up in small geysers of dirt as rounds fell short or skipped off the hard-packed earth. A water trough located near the center of the plaza was struck multiple times, the thick wood perforating and sending streams of water leaking into the dust. The horses, tied at the rails, terrified by the sudden eruption of violence, reared and pulled against their tethers. One animal, a sorrel mare belonging to a Horrell hand, was struck in the flank by a stray bullet. The horse screamed, a sound that cut through the gunfire, and thrashed wildly, snapping the reins and galloping blindly down an alleyway trailing blood. The Higgins faction, firing from the superior fortified positions of the Higgins and Wren's saloon and the surrounding buildings, maintained a withering rate of fire. They were using heavy caliber weapons, Sharps and Remingtons, mixed with the faster-firing Winchesters. The heavy buffalo rounds possessed enough kinetic energy to punch through the exterior walls of the Gem Saloon. Inside, the Horrell men found that the walls offered little protection. Bullets were coming through the clapboards, ripping through the interior partitions and smashing the mirrors behind the bar. The large mirror, a pride of the establishment, shattered in a spectacular cascade of silvered glass, crashing down onto the bottles of whiskey and brandy arranged below. The smell of high-proof alcohol instantly mixed with the sulfurous stench of black powder, creating a heady, toxic perfume of destruction. Mart shouted to his men to keep their heads down and fire low. He knew that the Higgins men were dug in, showing very little of themselves. To hit them, the Horrells had to be precise. They had to thread their shots through the loopholes and the cracks in the shutters. It was a game of angles played with high-velocity metal. A hired gunman named Carson, kneeling beside Mart, took careful aim at a puff of smoke on the roof of the livery stable. He squeezed the trigger, and across the square a man yelled out in pain, his rifle clattering down the sloped roof to land in the dirt below. A cheer went up from the Gem Saloon, a ragged, savage sound of approval. They had drawn blood. The volume of fire was unrelenting. Observers who were cowering in cellars blocks away later reported that the shooting did not sound like individual gunshots, but rather like a continuous roll of thunder that did not cease. The air in the square became choked with smoke. The black powder used in the cartridges of 1877 produced a thick white cloud upon ignition. With hundreds of rounds being fired per minute, the visibility in the plaza dropped rapidly. The combatants were firing into a fog, aiming at the orange flashes of the enemy muzzles. The smoke hung low in the humid air, stinging the eyes and coating the throats of the men with a gritty residue. Inside the Higgins stronghold, Pink Higgins stood calmly near a window, directing the fire of his men. He was not firing wildly, he was conserving his ammunition, waiting for a clear target. He watched the door of the Gem Saloon, knowing that sooner or later someone would try to make a run for it. He saw the door frame splinter as a round from his side struck the wood. He saw the dust puff out from the interior. He was methodically dismantling the shelter of his enemies. He turned to Bill Wren and ordered him to focus his fire on the lower sections of the walls, hoping to hit the men lying prone on the floor. Wren nodded, his face blackened by powder smoke, and adjusted his aim. The civilians of Lampasas, those who had not fled, were huddled in the deepest recesses of their homes. The sound of the battle was terrifying, vibrating the floorboards and rattling the dishes in the cupboards. A stray bullet, fired at a high angle from the Horrell side, arced over the buildings and punched through the roof of the general store, burying itself in a sack of flour. The grocer, hiding behind his counter, watched the white powder spill out onto the floor, a mundane casualty of the war. There was no law enforcement to call. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen. The town had been surrendered to the two armies, and the citizens were merely spectators to the destruction of their own community. Back in the gem, the heat was becoming unbearable. The lack of ventilation, combined with the hot barrels of the rifles and the body heat of the men, turned the saloon into an oven. Sweat poured down the faces of the fighters, stinging their eyes. Mart Horrell wiped his face with a dirty sleeve, smearing soot and sweat across his skin. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey that had miraculously survived the destruction of the bar, pulled the cork with his teeth, and took a long swig. He passed the bottle to Tom. The alcohol burned the throat, but it steadied the hands. They were in a siege now. There was no riding out. The street was a river of death that could not be crossed. The woodwork of the gem saloon was being chewed to pieces. The decorative trim around the windows was gone, shot away. The swinging doors were hanging by a single hinge, swinging crazily every time a bullet struck them. The floor was covered in a layer of brass casings, slippery and treacherous. Men slipped and cursed as they moved from window to window, trying to find a better angle. A man named Jones, fighting alongside the Horrells, took a graze to the arm. A bullet plowed a furrow through his bicep, tearing the shirt and the skin. He grunted, looked at the blood welling up, and tied a bandana around it tight. He picked his rifle back up. It was not a killing wound. He kept fighting. The intensity of the firefight began to degrade the structures themselves. The sheer weight of the metal flying across the square was compromising the integrity of the buildings. A support post on the porch of the Higgins saloon was nearly severed, whittled away by repeated hits until it looked like an hourglass. The sign hanging above the gem saloon, painted with bold letters, was riddled with holes, swinging wildly as bullets struck the chains holding it. The physical environment of the town was being reshaped by the ballistics of the Feud. What had been a place of commerce was being sculpted into a ruin. Tom Horrell, his hip aching with a deep throbbing pulse, found a rhythm in the chaos. He stopped aiming for individuals and started aiming for suppression. He fired at the windows, at the roofline, at the rain barrels. He wanted to keep the Higgins men heads down. He wanted to buy time for his men to reload. He emptied the tube magazine of his Winchester, the hammer clicking on an empty chamber. He sat down heavily with his back to the wall, grabbing a box of cartridges. He pushed the rounds into the loading gate one by one, his thumb calloused and blackened. Click, click, click. The sound of reloading was the heartbeat of the battle. As long as they had ammunition, they were alive. Across the way, Higgins noticed the rate of fire from the gem slowing slightly as men reloaded. He seized the opportunity. He ordered a concentrated volley. "Pour it on them," he shouted, his voice cracking over the roar. 10 rifles fired at once, all aimed at the main window of the gem. The result was devastating. The remaining wood of the window frame vanished. A storm of slugs tore through the opening, ripping into the back wall, shredding the upholstery of a billiards chair, and smashing the hanging lamp above the pool table. The lamp fell, crashing onto the felt, spilling kerosene. It did not catch fire immediately, but the threat was there. The smell of the fuel added a new layer of danger to the room. Mart saw the lamp fall. He kicked it away from the pool table, sending it skittering into a corner. He knew that fire was their greatest enemy. If the saloon burned, they would be flushed out into the open square where they would be cut down in seconds. He yelled at his men to watch for sparks. They were fighting 2 enemies now. Higgins and the potential for an inferno. The desperation in the room ratcheted up a notch. They were trapped in a wooden box that was being disassembled from the outside in. The sun moved imperceptibly across the sky, dragging the time with it. It felt as though they had been fighting for hours, but it had been less than 30 minutes. The intensity of the violence warped the perception of time. Every second was defined by a muzzle flash or the thud of a bullet striking timber. The men were operating in a state of hyper-reality where every detail was magnified. They saw the grain of the wood as it splintered. They saw the rotation of the cylinder on a revolver. They saw the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the smoke. On the roof of the hardware store, adjacent to the Higgins position, a marksman named Mitchell lay prone. He had a clear view of the side alley next to the gem. He was waiting for a flank. He was the insurance policy. If the Horrells tried to break out the back, Mitchell would be the one to stop them. He lay still, ignoring the ants crawling on his hand, ignoring the sun baking his back. He watched the alley. He saw a cat dart across the opening, terrified. He did not move his rifle. He was waiting for a larger target. The noise of the battle rolled out into the countryside, heard by farmers miles away. They stopped their plowing, looking toward the town. They saw the column of white smoke rising into the still air, a man-made storm cloud. They knew what it meant. The war had finally come to a head. They shook their heads and went back to their furrows, glad to be turning soil instead of dodging bullets. But in town, there was no escape. The battle was a black hole, drawing all attention and energy into its center. Inside the gem, the ammunition supply was holding, but the water was gone. The men were parched, their tongues swelling in their mouths. The dust and the smoke had dried them out completely. Tom looked at the water. Bucket. It had been kicked over in the scramble. He cursed. They would have to fight thirsty. It was just another hardship to endure. He looked at Mart. Mart's face was a mask of grim determination. He was not afraid. He was angry. He was fueled by a rage that burned cleaner than the kerosene. He wanted Higgins dead more than he wanted water. The exchange of fire settled into a brutal, grinding attrition. The initial frantic energy had burned off, replaced by a steady, methodical destruction. The shooters were taking more care now. They were learning the patterns of the enemy. They were timing their shots. Higgins's men were targeting specific firing ports. Horrell's men were targeting the muzzle flashes. It was a deadly conversation spoken in the language of ballistics. The square between them was a no-man's land, a zone of death where nothing could live. A tumbleweed rolled into the street, pushed by a sudden gust of wind. It was disintegrated by a volley of shots blown apart as if it were an attacking soldier. The men were shooting at anything that moved. As the first hour of the engagement drew to a close, the town square of Lampasas was unrecognizable. The facades of the buildings were pockmarked and shattered. The street was littered with debris, the air was a poisonous smog. And yet the shooting continued. Neither side was willing to yield. The Horrells were pinned, but defiant. Higgins was aggressive but cautious. The battle for the square had begun with a single shot, but it had evolved into a meat grinder. The outcome was far from certain. The only certainty was that the supply of ammunition was finite, and the supply of hatred was infinite. Mart Horrell ejected a spent casing, watching it spin through the air to land on the pile at his feet. He looked out the ruined window at the smoke-shrouded building across the way. He narrowed his eyes, fighting the sting of the powder. He whispered a promise to the man hiding behind those walls. This wasn't over. They were just getting started. He raised the rifle again. The battle raged on, a symphony of destruction played out under the merciless Texas sun. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June 7, 1877, The engagement in the Lampasas town square had transitioned from a frantic skirmish into a mechanized siege of attrition. The sun had moved past its zenith, angling its rays to strike the western facades of the buildings, illuminating the Higgins and Wren saloon while casting the shattered front of the Gem saloon into a deepening, smoky shadow. The heat of the day had combined with the thermal output of hundreds of discharged cartridges to create a localized temperature zone that felt like the interior of a brick kiln. The men on both sides were drenched in sweat that had turned to mud as it mixed with the airborne grit of pulverized limestone and plaster. The romance of the gunfight, if any had existed in the minds of the participants, had been utterly erased by the grinding reality of sustained combat. It was now a job of work, a repetitive cycle of loading, aiming, firing, and ducking the return fire that chipped away at their cover with terrifying regularity. The physical environment of the square was being systematically dismantled by the ballistics of the weaponry involved. The Higgins faction, firing from their fortified positions, employed a significant number of heavy-caliber rifles, including Sharps and Remingtons chambered for 50-caliber or 45-70 government cartridges. These heavy slugs, weighing hundreds of grains, possessed a momentum that ignored the flimsy clapboard siding of the frontier architecture. A bullet fired from the Higgins saloon did not simply stop upon hitting the exterior wall of the Gem. It punched through the pine siding, shattered the lath and plaster of the interior wall, and continued with lethal velocity across the room. The men inside the Gem quickly learned that cover was a relative term. A standard table offered no protection against a buffalo gun. The Horrells and their men were forced to stack furniture, layer sandbags if they had them, or flatten themselves against the floorboards to avoid the horizontal rain of metal. Pink Higgins, operating from the second story of his stronghold, maintained a cold command over his forces. He understood the geometry of the battle. He knew that the Gem saloon was a trap, a wooden box with limited exits, and he intended to turn it into a coffin. He directed his men to concentrate their fire on the structural supports of the enemy building. He wanted to degrade the integrity of the saloon to the point of collapse, or at least to the point where the fear of collapse would force the Horrells into the street. The sound of the bullets striking the timber was a constant rhythmic thudding, distinct from the sharp crack of the muzzle blasts. It was the sound of a building being eaten alive by copper and steel. Bill Wren, one of Higgins's most loyal lieutenants, was positioned near a window on the ground floor, firing a lever-action Winchester with a steady cadence. He was a large target, but he used the heavy frame of the window as a shield, exposing only his right eye and the barrel of his rifle. At 2:30, a marksman from the Horrell side, likely Tom Horrell given the angle, managed to thread a bullet through the narrow gap in Wren's defenses. The 44 caliber slug struck the window frame first, tumbling slightly before hitting Wren in the upper shoulder. The impact spun him around, dropping his rifle to the floor. The bullet plowed through the trapezius muscle, missing the bone but tearing a wide channel through the flesh. Blood soaked his shirt instantly, turning the gray fabric black. Wren did not scream. He grunted, slid down the wall to a seated position, and pressed a hand against the wound. He called out that he was hit but alive. A companion tossed him a rag, and Wren packed the wound himself, his face pale but his expression hard. He picked up his rifle with his left hand, unable to shoulder it but unwilling to be unarmed. Across the square, the situation inside the Gem saloon was becoming desperate. The water supply was completely exhausted. The dust from the pulverized drywall hung in the air like a thick fog, coating the throats of the men and making every breath a labor. Mart Horrell lay prone behind the wreckage of the bar, his eyes red-rimmed and streaming tears from the irritation. He had ceased firing for the moment to let his rifle barrel cool. The steel had become hot enough to blister skin. He looked at his brother Tom, who was crouched behind a stack of overturned chairs. Tom was grimacing, shifting his weight constantly to find relief for his shattered hip. The vibration of the floorboards from the incoming fire was sending spikes of pain through his damaged pelvis, but he kept his rifle up, watching the street for any sign of a rush. The sheer volume of ammunition expended was staggering. By 3 o'clock, it was estimated that over 3,000 rounds had been fired across the plaza. The ground in front of the saloons was carpeted in brass casings that glittered in the sun. The air was so choked with sulfurous smoke that the combatants often fired at the memory of a target rather than a visible enemy. The wind had died down, refusing to clear the haze, leaving the square shrouded in a man-made storm. The sound was a continuous rolling roar that deadened the hearing. Men shouted orders that went unheard, communicating instead with hand signals and shoves. The ballistics of the conflict created strange phenomena within the buildings. Bullets striking the iron stove in the center of the gem saloon ricocheted with a high-pitched whine, spinning off into corners to bury themselves in the floor. Glass shards from the destroyed mirrors and windows were ground into a fine powder that covered everything. A bullet struck a bottle of whiskey on a high shelf that had somehow survived the initial volley, exploding it and showering the men below with glass and alcohol. The liquid ran down the wall, mixing with the dust to form a brown sludge. The smell of the spilled liquor was strong, a sharp contrast to the smell of burnt powder and blood. Frank Mitchell, fighting alongside the Higgins faction, decided to try for a better angle. He moved to the roof of the livery stable, crawling on his belly along the gentle slope of the shingles. He wanted to get a shot down into the rear of the gem saloon, hoping to catch the Horrells in a crossfire. He reached the peak of the roof and slowly raised his head. He was instantly spotted by one of the Horrell hired guns, a man with quick reflexes and a steady hand. A bullet struck Mitchell high in the face, snapping his head back and stealing his balance. He slid down the roof in a desperate scramble, boots skidding on the shingles, then pitched off the edge and hit the dirt hard. Frank Mitchell lay still, the fight going on without him. The Horrells were pinned. But they were not helpless. They were fighting with the ferocity of cornered badgers. At 3:30, a lull occurred in the shooting, a natural pause as both sides stopped to reload magazines and cool their weapons. The silence that fell over the town was heavy and unnatural. In that brief quiet, the sounds of the wounded could be heard. A man in the gem was moaning low and steady, clutching a leg that had been perforated by a ricochet. The sound of a child crying came from a cellar 2 streets over, a thin, terrified wail that cut through the tension. The combatants looked at each other, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes wide and white in the gloom. They drank from warm canteens, swished the water in their mouths to clear the grit, and swallowed the precious fluid. The truce of exhaustion lasted less than 5 minutes. It was broken by Mart Horrell, who saw a movement in the Higgins saloon that looked like a man preparing to throw something, perhaps a torch or a stick of dynamite. Mart fired the shot loud and startling in the quiet. The return fire was instantaneous and overwhelming. The roar resumed, louder than before, as if the brief rest had given the men new energy to destroy one another. The Higgins men poured a fusillade into the front door of the gem, finally shooting the hinges off completely. The heavy wooden doors fell inward with a crash, leaving the entrance gaping open. Now exposed to the direct line of sight from across the square, the Horrells had to scramble for deeper cover. They retreated into the back room of the saloon, a storage area lined with kegs of beer and crates of dry goods. They used the kegs as barricades, rolling them into place to form a secondary defensive line. The bullets chased them, thudding into the heavy oak of the barrels. One keg was pierced, sending a jet of pressurized beer foaming out onto the floor. The men slipped in the liquid, cursing as they fought to maintain their footing. The back room was darker, the only light coming from the open door leading to the main saloon. They were being pushed further into the trap. Pink Higgins watched the doors fall, He signaled to his men to hold the perimeter. He did not order a charge. He knew that charging into a dark room against men armed with repeating rifles and revolvers was suicide. He was content to keep them pinned and let the ballistics do the work. He ordered his men to fire high, aiming for the roof of the back room, hoping to bring the ceiling down on top of them. The rifles angled upward, the slugs tearing through the shingles and the rafters. Dust and debris began to rain down on the Horrells in the back room, a sign that the structure was failing. By 4 o'clock, the sun had dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the square. The debris field in the street had grown. Pieces of the buildings, shattered glass, dead animals, and thousands of brass casings littered the dirt. A stray dog that had been hiding under the boardwalk bolted, terrified by the noise, running straight through the line of fire. Miraculously, the animal was not hit, disappearing down an alleyway. The men watched it go, a fleeting reminder of a world where creatures could run free. They were not free. They were tethered to this square by their hatred and their fear. The toll on the combatants was physical and psychological. The constant recoil of the heavy rifles had bruised their shoulders black and blue. Their ears rang with a permanent tinnitus that masked normal sounds. Their fingers were blistered from touching hot metal. Dehydration was setting in, making their heads throb and their vision blur. Yet they did not stop. The feud had moved beyond reason. It was a test of endurance. Who could absorb the most punishment? Who could stay awake the longest? Who could keep pulling the trigger when their muscles screamed for rest? Casualties began to mount, though most were not fatal. The cover, however degraded, was doing its job of preventing mass death. But the injuries were gruesome. A Higgins man took a splinter of wood the size of a dagger through the cheek, driven by a bullet striking the window frame. He pulled it out himself, the blood pouring down his neck, and kept loading magazines for the man next to him. Another man on the Horrell side had his ear shot away, a clean removal that left him dizzy and shocked. The floor of both saloons was slick with blood, beer, and sweat. The weaponry itself began to fail under the stress. A Winchester in the hands of a Horrell man jammed hard, the brass casing expanding in the chamber and refusing to extract. He sat on the floor, using a knife to pry at the rim of the cartridge, cursing the mechanism. Without his rifle, he was reduced to his revolvers, weapons that were useless at this range against men behind cover. He felt naked, vulnerable. He threw the rifle down in disgust and grabbed a shotgun, waiting for the Higgins men to get close. As the afternoon wore on, the tactics shifted. The Higgins men began to use the angles of the buildings to bounce shots off the pavement and into the interior of the gem. These ricochets were unpredictable and deadly, whirring through the air with a terrifying buzz. One such bullet struck a cast-iron spittoon, ringing it like a bell and sending it spinning across the room. The unpredictability of the fire added to the stress. There was no safe place to stand. Death could come from the window, from the wall, or from the floor. Mart Horrell checked his ammunition supply. It was getting low. They had started with hundreds of rounds, but the rate of fire had depleted their stocks rapidly. He passed the word to conserve shots. "Don't fire unless you see a man," he hissed. "Make everyone count." The volume of fire from the gem dropped, becoming sporadic and aimed. This emboldened the Higgins men, who increased their own rate of fire, sensing the weakness. They hammered the back room, chipping away at the beer kegs, trying to punch through the oak staves to the men behind. Tom Horrell was slumped against a crate, his face gray. The pain in his hip was a blinding white noise that drowned out the battle. He was operating on pure instinct. He saw a shadow, he fired. He heard a noise, he shifted his aim. He was a machine, a component of the gunfight that had ceased to be human. He looked at Mart. Mart looked back. They shared a look of grim understanding. They were in a bad spot. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and running out of options. But they were Horrells. They would not surrender. They would die in this pile of rubble before they walked out with their hands up. The civilians in the town began to emerge tentatively from their cellars as the sun lowered, peeking through cracks in the shutters. They saw the devastation in the square. The Gem Saloon looked like it had been chewed by a giant beast. The Higgins saloon was pockmarked and scarred. The street was a wasteland. They realized that their town would never be the same. The scars on the buildings would be repaired, but the memory of this day would last for generations. The sheer violence of the event had stained the very soil of Lampasas. At 4:30, a new sound entered the fray. It was the sound of the Texas Rangers approaching, though the combatants did not know it yet. For now, it was just a distant rumble of hooves indistinguishable from the blood rushing in their ears. The battle remained a closed system, a duel between two heavyweights locked in a clinch. The Higgins men were trying to find a way to flank the Gem, sending men down the alleyways to get behind the building. The Horrells anticipated this, posting men at the rear door with shotguns. The chess match continued, played with human lives. Bill Wren, despite his wound, refused to leave the line. He sat propped against the wall, loading rifles for the other men. His left arm was useless, but his right hand worked with a frantic speed. He fed cartridges into the loading gates, wiping the blood from them before handing the weapons up. He was the armorer of the siege, keeping the guns fed. His dedication was a testament to the loyalty Higgins commanded. These men were not just hired guns, they were believers in the cause. The sun touched the horizon, turning the sky a brilliant bloody orange. The light in the square changed, the shadows stretching out to cover the debris. The muzzle flashes became more distinct in the dimming light, bright tongues of fire that marked the positions of the shooters. The battle entered its twilight phase. The accuracy dropped as the light failed, but the intensity did not. They fired at the flashes, tracing the lines of light back to the source. The night would bring a new set of problems. Darkness would allow movement. It would allow infiltration. Both sides knew that the coming night would be the most dangerous time of all. Inside the Gem, Mart Horrell made a decision. They could not stay in the back room forever. The walls were failing. The Jaska's ammunition was low. They needed to move. He looked at the rear door. It led to an alley that opened onto the creek. If they could get to the horses, if the horses were still there, they might have a chance. He signaled to Tom. They would wait for full dark. Then they would make their break. It was a gamble. If Higgins had the alley covered, they would be cut down. But staying meant certain death. The barrage continued, a relentless pounding that shook the teeth in their skulls. The Gem Saloon groaned under the assault, the timbers cracking, the roof sagging. It was a dying building protecting dying men. The ballistics had won. The barricades had failed. Now it was just flesh against fire. The battle for the square dragged on towards the night, a slow-motion tragedy that refused to end. It was the 27th day of July in the year 1877 when the dust on the horizon north of Lampasas signaled the arrival of a force that did not answer to local feuds or county politics. The town itself was a battered shell of its former civic identity, standing silent under the oppressive glare of the summer sun. The damage from the battle in the square was still fresh and visible to any observer. The facade of the Gem Saloon remained a splintered ruin, the wood scarred by thousands of impacts, while the opposing Higgins and Wren saloon bore the pockmarks of heavy-caliber impacts that had punched through the siding. The streets were empty of commerce, occupied only by the debris of war. Spent brass casings that had been trodden into the dirt, broken glass that glittered in the gutters, and the dried, dark stains of blood that had yet to be washed away by rain. The citizens who remained were ghosts in their own homes, peering through cracks in the shutters, waiting for the next eruption of violence. But the column of riders approaching was not a reinforcement for the Horrells or a mercenary band for Higgins. It was the frontier battalion of the Texas Rangers, and they rode with the distinct, disciplined formation of a military unit. At the head of the column rode Major John B. Jones, a man of slight stature but immense presence. He sat his horse with a rigid posture, his eyes shaded by the brim of his hat, scanning the town with a clinical detachment. Jones was not a lawman in the traditional sense of a sheriff or a marshal. He was a commander of a paramilitary force created to bring order to a chaotic frontier. The men riding behind him were heavily armed, carrying Sharps carbines and Colt revolvers, their saddlebags packed with enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged engagement. They were dusty from the road, their faces coated in a layer of gray grit, but their weapons were clean and their eyes were alert. They did not look at the townspeople with sympathy. They looked at them as subjects to be pacified. The Rangers represented the supreme authority of the state of Texas, an authority that had been notably absent from Lampasas County for months. Jones signaled for the column to halt in the center of the square, directly between the two scarred saloons. The symbolism was intentional. He was placing the state physically between the warring factions. He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He did not go to the sheriff's office. He knew Sheriff Sweet was impotent, a man paralyzed by the violence he was sworn to stop. Instead, Jones established his command post right there in the open. He ordered his men to set up a perimeter blocking the entrances to the square. He was declaring martial law in practice, if not in official terminology. He turned to his sergeant and issued a single, clear order. Disarm every man in the town limits. Anyone found with a firearm was to be arrested and shackled. There were to be no exceptions, no arguments, and no resistance. The effect of the Ranger arrival was immediate. The hired gunmen who had been loitering in the alleyways and the back rooms of the saloons melted away, slipping out of town through the creek beds and the brush. They were mercenaries who fought for profit, not ideology, and they had no desire to tangle with Major Jones. The Rangers moved through the town with a methodical efficiency, kicking open doors, checking cellars, and confiscating weapons. They piled the rifles and revolvers in a heap in the center of the square, a growing monument of steel and wood that represented the disarmament of the population. The sound of the Rangers working, the shouting of orders, the crashing of doors, the clatter of confiscated weapons, replaced the silence of the siege. Jones then turned his attention to the leadership. He did not send polite requests for a meeting. He sent armed detachments to the locations where Higgins and the Horrells were holed up. He sent a message that was blunt and non-negotiable. Present yourselves to the major immediately or be hunted down as enemies of the state. Jones possessed the legal authority to arrest them all for a litany of crimes ranging from disturbing the peace to murder. But his primary goal was not mass incarceration, which would likely spark a jailbreak or a riot. His goal was the cessation of hostilities. He wanted the shooting to stop, and he wanted it to stop that very hour. Pink Higgins received the summons at his ranch where he had retreated after the battle in the square. He listened to the Ranger sergeant looking at the carbines pointed in his direction. Higgins was a pragmatist. He knew he could fight the Horrells and he knew he could intimidate the sheriff, but fighting the Texas Rangers was a war he could not win. The Frontier Battalion had the resources of the entire state behind it. If he killed a Ranger, he would be hunted to the ends of the earth. Higgins nodded, holstered his revolver, and agreed to ride in. He gathered his top lieutenants, Bill Wren and Bob Mitchell, telling them to leave their long guns behind. They would go to town armed only with the knowledge that the game had changed. At the Horrell Ranch, the mood was darker. Mart and Tom were still recovering from the brutal fight in the square. Their bodies were maps of scar tissue and fresh bandages. The arrival of the Rangers felt like a closing of the net. Mart, his back stiff and painful, debated resistance. He had defied the state police years earlier, But the Rangers under Jones were a different breed. They were not political appointees. They were Indian fighters and veterans. Tom, leaning heavily on his cane, argued that they had no choice. Their ammunition was low, their hired guns were fleeing, and their bodies were broken. To fight now would be suicide. They agreed to the summons. They saddled their horses, the effort causing them visible pain, and rode toward town, leaving their rifles on the rack. The meeting took place on the afternoon of the 30th of July in the lobby of the local hotel, which Jones had commandeered. He set up a long table in the center of the room. He sat at the head, placing his revolver on the table in front of him, a visual reminder of who held the power. He ordered Higgins and his men to sit on one side and the Horrells to sit on the other. The tension in the room was a physical force, thick and suffocating. The men stared at each other with eyes that burned with months of accumulated hatred. Higgins looked at Mart Horrell, seeing the man he had tried to kill in the creek. Mart looked back, seeing the man who had executed his brother in the saloon. There were no handshakes. There were no greetings. There was only the sound of heavy breathing and the creak of leather gun belts. Jones did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke in a voice that was low, calm, and terrifyingly serious. He told them that the war was over. He told them that he did not care about their grievances, their stolen cattle, or their dead brothers. He cared about the peace of the state of Texas. He informed them that he had a list of indictments that he could activate at any moment. He could arrest every man in the room and haul them to the penitentiary in Huntsville. He could declare their ranches forfeit. He could make their lives a living hell of legal and physical harassment. Or they could sign a treaty. The document Jones placed on the table was not a complex legal brief. It was a simple, handwritten agreement that he had drafted himself. It stated that both parties agreed to lay down their arms, to disperse their gangs, to stop the provocative movement of armed men through the town, and to submit to the arbitration of the courts for any future disputes. It was a surrender of their right to private warfare. Jones pushed the inkwell and a steel-nibbed pen toward the center of the table. He waited. The yawn, silent, stretched out, measured by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mart Horrell was the first to move. He realized that the feud had become bad for business. The cattle were neglected, the fences were down, and the cost of hiring gunmen was draining everyone's capital. He reached out, took the pen, and signed his name in a script that was jagged but legible. Mart Horrell. He passed the pen to Tom, who signed next, his hand steady despite the pain that still lived in his hip. The Horrell brothers had put their names to the pledge on the 30th of July. Higgins stared at the paper. For him, signing was an admission that Merritt's death would not be chased forever by blood. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he looked at Bill Wren and at the Rangers standing guard at the doors, their faces impassive. He knew the era of the outlaw warlord was closing. The frontier was shrinking, and the law was becoming stronger than the gun. 2 days later, on the 2nd day of August, Higgins took the pen. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from rage contained. He signed his name. John Pinckney Higgins. Wren followed suit. The Higgins faction had agreed to the truce. Jones took the paper, blew on the ink to dry it, and folded it into his pocket. He did not smile. He told them that the truce was effective immediately. He told them that if a single shot was fired by either side, he would hold the leaders personally responsible. He would return, and next time he would not bring a piece of paper. He would bring a rope. He dismissed them. The men stood up, the chairs scraping loudly on the wooden floor. They filed out of the hotel, stepping into the sunlight of the square. They did not look at each other. They mounted their horses and rode in opposite directions, one group heading north, the other south. The occupation of Lampasas by the Rangers continued for several weeks. Jones did not trust the treaty to hold without enforcement. He kept his men in the town, patrolling the streets day and night. They enforced a strict curfew. They checked every wagon that entered the town for contraband weapons. They interviewed the shopkeepers, the bartender, and the sheriff, building a dossier on the events of the past 6 months. Jones was thorough. He wanted to ensure that the infrastructure of the feud was dismantled. Sheriff Sweet, seeing the effectiveness of the Rangers, attempted to reassert his authority, but he was largely ignored by the population. The people of Lampasas knew who had saved them. It was not the local badge, it was the state badge. The shopkeepers began to take down the boards from their windows. The glass was swept up. The bullet holes were patched with fresh pine. The town began the slow, painful process of healing. The economy, which had been strangled by the siege, began to breathe again. Wagons of goods arrived from Austin. The stagecoach resumed its regular schedule. The physical wounds of the combatants continued to heal, but the psychological wounds hardened into something permanent. Higgins went back to his ranch and focused on his cattle. He became a recluse, rarely coming to town and never without a bodyguard. He had signed the paper, but he did not trust the Horrells. He kept his rifle close, a habit he would never break. The feud had changed him from a rancher into a survivor, a man who saw threats in every shadow. The Horrells retreated to their holdings, but their power was broken. The loss of Merritt, the crippling injuries to Mart and Tom, and the forced dispersal of their army had reduced them to mere shadows of their former selves. They had fought the law, the neighbors, and the Higgins faction, and while they had not been killed, they had been neutralized. The prestige of the Horrell name, once a terrifying currency in the region, had been devalued by the treaty. They were no longer the kings of the county. They were just men with bad reputations and aching bones. Major Jones spent his days in the saddle, riding the circuit between the ranches, showing the flag. He met with the smaller landowners, the men who had been caught in the crossfire. He assured them that the state would protect them. He encouraged them to file complaints, to use the courts. He was rebuilding the civic trust that had been destroyed by the months of anarchy. It was slow work. The people were skeptical. They had seen how quickly civilization could collapse when strong men decided to kill each other. But the presence of the Rangers gave them a reason to hope. By late July, the town square had been cleared of the debris. The Gem Saloon was under repair, the sound of saws and hammers replacing the sound of gunfire. The water trough was fixed, holding clear water for the horses. The bloodstains in the dirt had faded under the sun and the traffic of wagons. To a stranger riding through, Lampasas might have looked like any other Texas town, perhaps a bit rougher around the edges but functional. But to those who lived there, the square was a graveyard of memories. Every building held a story of a near miss, a wound, or a death. The Rangers began to relax their grip slightly as August approached. The immediate threat of a reignited war had faded. The hired guns had moved on to other feuds in other counties. The intense heat of the summer made fighting unappealing. The biological imperative to survive and work the land took over. The cattle needed to be moved. The crops needed to be tended. The feud was a luxury they could no longer afford. Jones prepared his report for the adjutant general. He wrote with a dry, precise style detailing the number of arrests, the quantity of weapons seized, and the terms of the peace agreement. He did not embellish. He did not write about the fear in the eyes of the townspeople or the smell of the blood in the saloon. He wrote about logistics and results. He noted that the Horrell-Higgins disturbance had been quelled. He recommended that a small detachment of Rangers remain in the county for the remainder of the year to ensure compliance. On the 5th day of August, a Sunday, the church bell rang for the first time in months. The sound drifted across the rooftops, clear and sweet. The families came out of their houses dressed in their Sunday best, walking towards the white frame building. They walked past the saloon where Merritt Horrell had died. They walked past the spot where Bill Wren had bled. They walked past the hotel where the treaty had been signed. They entered the church and sat in the pews listening to the preacher speak of forgiveness and redemption. The combatants were not there. Higgins was at his ranch. The Horrells were at theirs. There was no forgiveness in their hearts, only a cold, hard pragmatism. But for the town, the bell was a signal that the nightmare was over. The Rangers eventually broke camp, leaving a sergeant and 3 men behind as the garrison. Major Jones mounted his horse, looking back at the town one last time. He had forced a peace, but he knew it was a fragile thing. It was held together by the threat of violence, not by genuine reconciliation. But in the violent world of 1877 Texas, that was often the best one could hope for. He turned his horse south, leading his column out of Lampasas, riding toward the next trouble spot, the next feud, the next town that needed to be saved from itself. The truce held. The shooting stopped. The open warfare that had defined the spring of 1877 did not return. The Horrells and Higgins would eventually meet their fates in other ways in other years, but the great battle for Lampasas was finished. The feud passed into history, becoming a story told by old men on porches, a cautionary tale of what happens when the law fails and the gun takes over. The scars on the buildings faded with time, painted over or weathered away. But the scars on the men in the community remained invisible and permanent, a legacy of the time when the town square turned deadly. The sun set on the 5th day of August, casting long shadows that stretched across the peaceful, silent streets. The crickets began to chirp in the tall grass. A coyote howled in the distance. The wind blew softly through the oak trees. Lampasas slept, exhausted, wounded, but alive. The war was over.